Section 0 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by B. Tootin. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bishey. Introduction. This translation of Xenophon's Memorabilia of Socrates was first published in 1712, and is here printed from the revised edition of 1722. Its author was Edward Bishey, who had produced in 1702 The Art of English Poetry, a well-known work that was near its fifth edition when its author published his translation of the Memorabilia. This was a translation that remained in good repute. There was another edition of it in 1758. Bishey translated the title of this book into The Memorable Things of Socrates. I have changed things into thoughts. For whether they be sayings or doings, the word and deeds of a wise man are alike expressions of his thought. Xenophon is said to have been, when young, a pupil of Socrates. Two authorities have recorded that in the flight from the battle of Delium in the year BC 424, when Xenophon fell from his horse, Socrates picked him up and carried him on his back for a considerable distance. The time of Xenophon's death is not known, but he was alive 67 years after the battle of Delium. When Cyrus the Younger was preparing war against his brother Artaxerxes Nemon, king of Persia, Xenophon went with him. After the death of Cyrus on the plains of Cunaxa, the barbarian auxiliaries fled, and the Greeks were left to return as they could from the far region between the Tigris and Euphrates. Xenophon had to take part in the conduct of the retreat, and tells the story of it in his Anabasis, a history of the expedition of the younger Cyrus and of the retreat of the Greeks. His return into Greece was the year of the death of Socrates, BC 399, but his association was now with the Spartans, with whom he fought, BC 394, at Coronea. Afterwards he settled, and lived for about 20 years, at Silis in Elea with his wife and children. At Silis he wrote probably his Anabasis and some other of his books. At last he was driven out by the Eleans. In the battle of Mantinea the Spartans and Athenians fought as allies, and Xenophon's two sons were in the battle. He had sent them to Athens as fellow combatants from Sparta. His banishment from Athens was repealed by change of times, but it does not appear that he returned to Athens. He is said to have lived, and perhaps died, at Corinth, after he had been driven from his home at Silis. Xenophon was a philosophic man of action. He could make his value felt in a council of war, take part in battle, one of his books is on the duties of a commander of cavalry, and show himself good sportsman in the hunting field. He wrote a book upon the horse, a treatise also upon dogs and hunting. He believed in God, thought earnestly about social and political duties, and preferred Spartan institutions to those of Athens. He wrote a life of his friend Agelaus II, king of Sparta. He found exercise for his energetic mind in writing many books. In writing he was clear and to the point. His practical mind made his work interesting. His Anabasis is a true story as delightful as a fiction. His Cyropaedia is a fiction full of truths. He wrote Hellenica, that carried on the history of Greece from the point at which Thucydides closed his history until the battle of Mantinea. He wrote a dialogue between Hiero and Simonides upon the position of a king, and dealt with the administration of the little realm of a man's household in his Economicus, a dialogue between Socrates and Critobulus, which includes the praise of agriculture. He wrote also, like Plato, a symposium, in which philosophers over their wine reason of love and friendship, and he paints the character of Socrates. But his best memorial of his old guide, philosopher, and friend is this work, in which Xenophon brought together in simple and direct form the views of life that had been made clear to himself by the teaching of Socrates. Xenophon is throughout opposing a plain tale to the false accusations against Socrates. He does not idealize, but he feels strongly, and he shows clearly the worth of the wisdom that touches at every point the actual conduct of the lives of men. H.M. End of Section 0. Recording by B. Tootin. Section 1 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by B. Tootin. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bishey. Book 1, Chapter 1. Socrates not a contemner of the gods of his country, nor an introducer of new ones. I have often wondered by what show of argument the accusers of Socrates could persuade the Athenians he had forfeited his life to the state. For though the crimes laid under his charge were indeed great, that he did not acknowledge the gods of the republic, that he introduced new ones, and farther had debauched the youth, yet none of these could in the least be proved against him. For as to the first, that he did not worship the deities which the republic adored, how could this be made out against him, since instead of paying no homage to the gods of his country, he was frequently seen to assist in sacrificing to them, both in his own family and in the public temples, perpetually worshipping them in the most public, solemn, and religious manner. What, in my opinion, gave his accusers a specious pretext for alleging against him that he introduced new deities was this, that he had frequently declared in public he had received counsel from a divine voice, which he called his demon. But this was no proof at all of the matter. All that Socrates advanced about his demon was no more than what is daily advanced by those who believe in and practice divination. And if Socrates, because he said he received intelligence from his genius, must be accused of introducing new divinities, so also must they. For it is not certain that those who believe in divination, and practice that belief, do observe the flight of birds, consult the entrails of victims, and remark even unexpected words and accidental occurrences? But they do not therefore believe that either the birds whose flight they observe, or the persons that they meet accidentally, know either their good or ill fortune. Neither did Socrates. They only believe that the gods make use of these things to presage the future, and such, too, was the belief of Socrates. The vulgar, indeed, imagine it to be the very birds and things which present themselves to them that excite them to what is good for them, or make them avoid what may hurt them. But as for Socrates, he freely owned that a demon was his monitor, and he frequently told his friends beforehand what they should do or not do, according to the instructions he had received from his demon. And they who believed him and followed his advice always found advantage by it, as, on the contrary, they who neglected his admonitions never failed to repent their incredulity. Now it cannot be denied but that he ought to have taken care not to pass with his friends either for a liar or a visionary. And yet how could he avoid incurring that censure if the events had not justified the truth of the things he pretended were revealed to him? It is therefore manifest that he would not have spoken of things to come if he had not believed he said true. But how could he believe he said true unless he believed that the gods, who alone ought to be trusted for the knowledge of things to come, gave him notice of them? And if he believed they did so, how can it be said that he acknowledged no gods? He likewise advised his friends to do, in the best manner they could, the things that of necessity they were to do. But as to those whose events were doubtful, he sent them to the oracles to know whether they should engage in them or not. And he thought that they who designed to govern with success their families or whole cities had great need of receiving instructions by the help of divinations. For though he indeed held that every man may make choice of the condition of life in which he desires to live, and that by his industry he may render himself excellent in it, whether he apply himself to architecture or to agriculture, whether he throw himself into politics or economy, whether he engage himself in the public revenues or in the army, yet that in all these things the gods have reserved to themselves the most important events, into which men of themselves can in no wise penetrate. Thus he who makes a fine plantation of trees knows not who shall gather the fruit. He who builds a house cannot tell who shall inhabit it. A general is not certain that he shall be successful in his command, nor a minister of state in his ministry. He who marries a beautiful woman in hopes of being happy with her knows not but that even she herself may be the cause of all his uneasinesses, and he who enters into a grand alliance is uncertain whether they with whom he allies himself will not at length be the cause of his ruin. This made him frequently say that it is a great folly to imagine there is not a divine providence that presides over these things, and that they can in the least depend on human prudence. He likewise held it to be a weakness to importune the gods with questions which we may resolve ourselves. as if we should ask them whether it be better to take a coachman who knows how to drive than one who knows nothing of the matter, whether it be more eligible to take an experienced pilot than one who is ignorant. In a word, he counted it as a kind of impiety to consult the oracles concerning what might be numbered or weighed, because we ought to learn the things which the gods have been pleased to capacitate us to know, but that we ought to have recourse to the oracles to be instructed in those that surpass our knowledge, because the gods are wont to discover them to such men as have rendered them propitious to themselves. Socrates stayed seldom at home. In the morning he went to the places appointed for walking and public exercises. He never failed to be at the hall or courts of justice at the usual hour of assembling there, and the rest of the day he was at the places where the greatest companies generally met. There it was that he discoursed for the most part, and whoever would hear him easily might. And yet no man ever observed the least impiety either in his actions or his words. Nor did he amuse himself to reason the secrets of nature, or to search into the manner of the creation of what the sophists call the world, nor to dive into the cause of the motions of the celestial bodies. On the contrary, he exposed the folly of such as give themselves up to these contemplations, and he asked whether it was, after having acquired a perfect knowledge of human things, that they undertook to search into the divine, or if they thought themselves very wise in neglecting what concerned them, to employ themselves in things above them. He was astonished likewise that they did not see it was impossible for men to comprehend anything of all these wonders, seeing they who have the reputation of being most knowing in them are of quite different opinions, and can agree no better than so many fools and madmen. For as some of these are not afraid of the most dangerous and frightful accidents, while others are in dread of what is not to be feared, so too among those philosophers some are of opinion that there is no action but what may be done in public, nor word that may not freely be spoken before the whole world, while others, on the contrary, believe that we ought to avoid the conversation of men and keep in a perpetual solitude. Some have despised the temples and the altars, and have taught not to honor the gods, while others have been so superstitious as to worship wood, stones, and irrational creatures. And as to the knowledge of natural things, some have confessed but one only being, others have admitted an infinite number, some have believed that all things are in a perpetual motion, others that nothing moves. Some have held the world to be full of continual generations and corruptions, others maintain that nothing is engendered or destroyed. He said besides that he should be glad to know of those persons whether they were in hopes one day to put in practice what they learned, as men who know an art may practice it when they please, either for their own advantage or for the service of their friends, or whether they did imagine that after they found out the causes of all things that happen, they should be able to cause winds and rains, and to dispose the times and seasons as they had occasion for them, or whether they contented themselves with the bare knowledge without expecting any farther advantage. This was what he said of those who delight in such studies. As for his part, he meditated chiefly on what is useful and proper for man, and took delight to argue of piety and impiety, of honesty and dishonesty, of justice and injustice, of wisdom and folly, of courage and cowardice, of the state and of the qualifications of a minister of state, of the government, and of those who are fit to govern. In short, he enlarged on the like subjects which it becomes men of condition to know, and of which none but slaves should be ignorant. It is not strange, perhaps, that the judges of Socrates mistook his opinion in things concerning which he did not explain himself. But I am surprised that they did not reflect on what he had said and done in the face of the whole world. For when he was one of the Senate, and had taken the usual oath exactly to observe the laws, being in his turn vested with the dignity of epistate, he bravely withstood the populace, who, against all manner of reason, demanded that the 9 captains, 2 of whom were Racinides and Thrasyllus, should be put to death. He would never give consent to this injustice, and was not daunted at the rage of the people, nor at the menaces of the men in power, choosing rather not to violate the oath he had taken than to yield to the violence of the multitude, and shelter himself from the vengeance of those who threatened him. To this purpose he said that the gods watch over men more attentively than the vulgar imagine, for they believe there are some things which the gods observe, and others which they pass by unregarded. But he held that the gods observe all our actions and all our words, that they penetrate even into our most secret thoughts, that they are present at all our deliberations, and that they inspire us in all our affairs. It is astonishing, therefore, to consider how the Athenians could suffer themselves to be persuaded that Socrates entertained any unworthy thoughts of the deity. He who never let slip one single word against the respect due to the gods, nor was ever guilty of any action that savored in the least of impiety, but who, on the contrary, has done and said things that could not proceed but from a mind truly pious, and that are sufficient to gain a man an eternal reputation of piety and virtue. End of section 1. Recording by B. Tooten.
Section 2 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Elfman. Book 1, Chapter 2. Socrates, not a debaucher of youth. What surprises me yet more is that some would believe that Socrates was a debaucher of young men. Socrates, the most sober and most chaste of all men, who cheerfully supported both cold and heat, whom no inconvenience, no hardships, no labors could startle, and who had learned to wish for so little that though he had scarce anything, he had always enough. Then how could he teach impiety, justice, gluttony, impurity, and luxury? And so far was he from doing so that he reclaimed many persons from those vices, inspiring them with the love of virtue and putting them in hopes of coming to preferment in the world, provided they would take a little care of themselves. Yet he never promised any man to teach him to be virtuous, but as he made a public profession of virtue, he created in the minds of those who frequented him the hopes of becoming virtuous by his example. He neglected not his own body, and praised not those that neglected theirs. In like manner, he blamed the custom of some who eat too much, and afterwards use violent exercises, but he approved of eating till nature be satisfied, and of a moderate exercise after it, believing that method to be an advantage to health, and proper to unbend and divert the mind. In his clothes he was neither nice nor costly, and what I say of his clothes ought likewise to be understood of his whole way of living. Never any of his friends became covetous in his conversation, and he reclaimed them from that sordid disposition, as well as from all others, for he would accept no gratuity from any who desired to confer with him, and said that was the way to discover a noble and generous heart, and that they who take reward betrays a meanness of soul, and sell their persons because they impose on themselves a necessity of instructing those from whom they receive a salary. He wondered likewise why a man who promises to teach such virtue should ask money, as if he believed not the greatest of all gain to consist in the acquisition of a good friend, or as if he feared that he who, by his means, should become virtuous, and be obliged to him for so great a benefit, would not be sufficiently grateful for it. Quite different from Socrates, who never boasted of any such thing, and who was most certain that all who heard him and received his maxims would love him forever, and be capable of loving others also. After this, whosoever says that such a man debauched the youth must at the same time say that the study of virtue is debauchery. But the accuser says that Socrates taught to despise the constitution that was established in the Republic, because he affirmed it to be a folly to elect magistrates by lots, since if anyone had occasion for a pilot, a musician, or an architect, he would not trust to chance for any such person, though the faults that can be committed by men in such capacities are far from being of so great importance as those that are committed in the government of the Republic. He says, therefore, that such arguments insensibly accustom the youth to despise the laws and render them more audacious and more violent. But, in my opinion, such as study the art of prudence, and who believe they shall be able to render themselves capable of giving good advice and counsel to their fellow citizens, seldom become men of violent tempers, because they know that violence is hateful and full of danger, while, on the contrary, to win by persuasion is full of love and safety. For they whom we have compelled brood a secret hatred against us, believing we have done them wrong. But those whom we have taken the trouble to persuade continue our friends, believing we have done them a kindness. It is not, therefore, they who apply themselves to the study of prudence that become violent, but those brutish, intractable tempers who have much power in their hands and put little judgment to management. He farther said that when a man desires to carry anything by force, he must have many friends to assist him. As on the contrary, he that can persuade has need of none but himself, and is not subject to shed blood. For who would rather choose to kill a man than to make use of his services, after having gained his friendship and goodwill by mildness? The accuser adds, in proof of the ill tendency of the doctrine of Socrates, that Critias and Alcibiades, who were two of his most intimate friends, were very bad men, and did much mischief to their country. For Critias was the most insatiable and cruel of all the 30 tyrants, and Alcibiades the most dissolute, the most insolent, and the most audacious citizen that ever the Republic had. As for me, I pretend not to justify them, and will only relate for what reasons they frequented Socrates. They were men of an unbound ambition, and who resolved whatever it cost to govern the state, and make themselves be talked of. They had heard that Socrates lived very content upon little or nothing, that he entirely commanded his passions, and that his reasonings were so persuasive that he drew all men to which side he pleased. Reflecting on this, and being of the temper we mentioned, can it be thought that they desired the acquaintance of Socrates, because they were in love with his way of life, and with his temperance, or because they believed that by conversing with him they should render themselves capable of reasoning aright, and of well managing the public affairs? For my part, I believe that if the gods had proposed to them to live always like him, or to die immediately, they would rather have chosen sudden death. And it is easy to judge this from their actions, for as soon as they thought themselves more capable than their companions, they forsook Socrates, whom they had frequented, only for the purpose I mentioned, and threw themselves wholly into business. It may, perhaps, be objected that he ought not to have discoursed to his friends of things relating to the government of the state, till after he had taught them to live virtuously. I have nothing to say to this, but I observe that all who profess teachings do generally 2 things. They work in presence of their scholars, to show them how they ought to do, and they instruct them likewise by word of mouth. Now in either of these 2 ways no man ever taught to live well, like Socrates, for in his whole life he was an example of untainted probity, and in his discourses he spoke of virtue and of all the duties of man, and made him admired of all his hearers. And I know, too, very well that Critias and Alcibiades lived very virtuously as long as they frequented him. Not that they were afraid of him, but because they thought it most conducive to their designs to live so at the time. Many who pretend to philosophy will here object that a virtuous person is always virtuous, and that when a man has once come to be good and temperate, he will never afterwards become wicked nor dissolute, because habitudes that can be acquired, when once they are so, can never more be effaced from the mind. But I am not of this opinion, for as they who use no bodily exercises are awkward and unwieldy in their actions of the body, so they who exercise not their minds are incapable of the noble actions of the mind, and have not courage enough to undertake anything worthy of praise, nor command enough over themselves to abstain from things that are forbid. For this reason, parents, though they be well enough assured of the good natural disposition of their children, fail not to forbid them the conversation of the vicious. For it is the ruin of worthy dispositions, whereas the conversation of good men is a continual meditation of virtue. Thus, a poet says, "By those whom we frequent we're ever led, example is a law by all obeyed, thus with the good we are to good inclined, but vicious company corrupts the mind." And another, in the like manner, "Virtue and vice in the same manner found, and now they gain, and now they lose their ground." And, in my opinion, they are in the right, for when I consider that they who have learned verses by heart forget them unless they repeat them often, so I believe that they who neglect the reasoning of philosophers insensibly lose the remembrance of them, and when they have let these excellent notions slip out of their minds, they at the same time lose the idea of the things that supported in the soul the love of temperance. And, having forgot these things, what wonder is it if at length they forget temperance likewise? I observe, besides, that men who abandon themselves to the debauches of wine or women find it more difficult to apply themselves to things that are profitable, and to abstain from what is hurtful. For many who live frugally before they fall in love become prodigal when that passion gets the mastery over them, insomuch that after having wasted their estates they are reduced to gain their bread by methods they would have been ashamed of before. What hinders then but that a man who was once temperate should be so no longer, and that he who has led a good life at one time should not do so at another? I should think, therefore, that the being of all virtues, and chiefly of temperance, depends on the practice of them, for lust that dwells in the same body with the soul entices it continually to despise this virtue, and to find out the shortest way to gratify the senses only. Thus, whilst Alcibiades and Critias conversed with Socrates, they were able, with so great an assistance, to tame their inclinations. But after they had left him, Critias, being retired into Thessaly, ruined himself entirely in the company of some libertines, and Alcibiades, seeing himself courted by several women of quality, because of his beauty, and suffering himself to be corrupted by soothing flatterers, who made their court to him, in consideration of the credit he had in the city and with his allies. In a word, finding himself respected by all the Athenians, and that no man disputed the first rank with him, began to neglect himself and acted like a great wrestler, who takes not the trouble to exercise himself when he no longer finds an adversary who dares to contend with him. If we would examine, therefore, all that has happened to them, if we consider how much the greatness of their birth, their interest, and their riches had puffed up in their minds, if we reflect on the ill company they fell into, and the many opportunities they had of debauching themselves, can we be surprised that, after they had been so long absent from Socrates, they arrived at length to that height of insolence to which they have been seen to arise? If they had been guilty of crimes, the accuser will load Socrates with them, and not allow him to be worthy of praise, for having kept them within the bounds of their duty during their youth, when, in all appearance, they would have been the most disorderly and least governable. This, however, is not the way we judge of other things. For whoever pretended that a musician, a player on the lute, or any other person that teaches, after he had made a good scholar, ought to be blamed for his growing more ignorant under the care of another master? If a young man gets an acquaintance that brings him into debauchery, ought his father to lay the blame on the first friends of his son, among whom he always lived virtuously? Is it not true, on the contrary, that the more he finds that this last friendship proves destructive to him, the more reason he will have to praise his former acquaintance? And are the fathers themselves, who are daily with their children, guilty of their faults, if they give them no ill example? Thus they ought to have judged of Socrates. If he led an ill life, it was reasonable to esteem him vicious. But if a good, was it just to accuse him of crimes of which he was innocent? And yet he might have given his adversaries ground to accuse him, had he but approved or seemed to approve those vices in others, from which he kept himself free. But Socrates abhorred vice, not only in himself, but in everyone besides, to prove which I need only relate his conduct towards Critias, a man extremely addicted to debauchery. Socrates, perceiving that this man had an unnatural passion for Euthydemus, and that the violence of it would precipitate him so far a length as to make him transgress the bounds of nature, shocked at his behavior, he exerted his utmost strength of reason and argument to dissuade him from so wild a desire. And while the impetuous of Critias's passion seemed to scorn all check or control, and the modest rebuke of Socrates had been disregarded, the philosopher, out of an ardent zeal for virtue, broke out in such language as at once declared his own strong inward sense of decency and order, and the monstrous shamefulness of Critias's passion. Which severe but just reprimand of Socrates, it is thought was the foundation of that grudge which he ever after bore him, for during the tyranny of the 30, of which Critias was one, when together with Cherocles he had the care of the civil government of the city, he failed not to remember this affront, and in revenge of it made a law to forbid teaching the art of reasoning in Athens. And having nothing to reproach Socrates with in particular, he labored to render him odious by aspersing him with the usual calumnies that are thrown on all philosophers. For I have never heard Socrates say he taught this art, nor seen any man who ever heard him say so, but Critias had taken offense, and such sufficient proofs of it. For after the 30 had caused to be put to death a great number of citizens, and even of the most eminent, had let loose the reins to all sorts of violence and rapine. Socrates said in a certain place that he wondered very much that a man who keeps a herd of cattle by his ill conduct loses every day some of them, and suffers the others to fall away, would not own himself to be a very ill keeper of his herd, that he should wonder yet more if a minister of state who lessens every day the number of its citizens, and makes the others more dissolute, was not ashamed of his ministry, and would not own himself to be an ill magistrate. This was reported to Critias and Cherocles, for forthwith sent to Socrates, showing him the law they had made, forbid him to discourse with the young men, upon which Socrates asked them whether they would permit him to propose a question, that he might be informed of what he did not understand in his prohibition, and his request being granted, he spoke in this manner: I am most ready to obey your laws, but that I may not transgress through ignorance, I desire to know of you, whether you condemn the art of reasoning because you believe it consists in saying things well, or in saying them ill. If for the former reason, we must then, from henceforward, abstain from speaking as we ought, and if for the latter, It is plain that we ought to endeavor to speak well." At these words Pericles flew into a passion and said to him, "Since you pretend to be ignorant of things that are so easily known, we forbid you to speak to the young man in any manner whatever." "It is enough," answered Socrates, "but that I may not be in a perpetual uncertainty, pray prescribe to me till what age men are young." "Till they are capable of being members of the Senate," said Pericles. "In a word, speak to no man under 30 years of age." "How?" says Socrates. "If I would buy anything of a tradesman who is not 30 years old, am I forbid to ask him the price of it?" "I mean not so," answered Pericles, "but I am not surprised that you ask me this question, for it is your custom to ask many things that you know very well." Socrates added, "And if a young man ask me in the street where Pericles lodges, or whether I know where Critias is, must I make him no answer?" "I mean not so neither," answered Pericles. Here Critias interrupted their discourse, said, "For the future, Socrates, you must have nothing to do with the city tradesmen, the shoemakers, masons, smiths, and other mechanics, whom you so often lead as examples of life, and who, I apprehend, are quite jaded with your discourses." "I must then likewise," replied Socrates, "omit the consequence I draw from those discourses, and have no more to do with justice, piety, and the other duties of a good man." "Yes, yes," said Pericles, "and I advise you to meddle no more with those that tend herds of oxen, otherwise take care you lose not your own." And these last words made it appear that Critias and Pericles had taken offense at the discourse which Socrates had held against their government, when he compared them to a man that suffers his herd to fall to ruin. Thus we see how Critias frequented Socrates, and what opinion they had of each other. I add, moreover, that we cannot learn anything of a man whom we do not like. Therefore, if Critias and Alcibiades made no great improvement with Socrates, it proceeded from this, that they never liked him. For at the very time that they had conversed with him, they always rather courted the conversation of those who were employed in the public affairs, because they had no design but to govern. The following conference of Alcibiades in particular, which he had with Pericles, his governor, who was the chief man of the city, whilst he was yet under 20 years of age, concerning the nature of the laws, will confirm what I have now advanced. "Pray," says Alcibiades, "explain to me what the law is, for as I hear men praise to observe the laws, I imagine that this praise cannot be given to those who know not what the law is." "It is easy to satisfy you," answered Pericles. "The law is only what the people in the General Assembly ordain, declaring what ought to be done and what ought not to be done." "And tell me," added Alcibiades, "they ordain to do what is good or what is ill?" "Most certainly what is good," Alcibiades pursued. "And how would you call what a small number of citizens should ordain, in states where the people is not the master, but all is ordered by the advice of a few persons who possess the sovereignty?" "I would call whatever they ordain a law, for laws are nothing else but the ordinances of sovereigns." "If a tyrant then ordained anything, would that be a law?" "Yes, it will," said Pericles. "But what then is violence and injustice?" continued Alcibiades. "Is it not when the strongest makes himself be obeyed by the weakest, not by consent, but by force only?" "In my opinion it is." "It follows, then," says Alcibiades, "that ordinances made by a prince without the consent of the citizens would be absolutely unjust." "I believe so," said Pericles, "and cannot allow that the ordinances of a prince, when they are made without the consent of the people, should bear the name of laws." "And what the chief citizens ordain without procuring the consent of the great number, is that likewise a violence?" "There is no question of it," answered Pericles, "and in general every ordinance made without the consent of those who are to obey it is a violence rather than a law." "And is what the populace decree without the concurrence of the chiefs to be counted a violence likewise, not a law?" "No doubt it is," said Pericles, "but when I was of your age, I could resolve all these difficulties, because I made it my business to inquire into them as you do now." "Would to God," cried Alcibiades, "I had been so happy as to have conversed with you then when you had understood these matters better." To this purpose was their dialogue. Critias and Alcibiades, however, continued not long with Socrates, after they believed they had improved themselves, and gained some advantages over the other citizens. For besides that they thought not his conversation very agreeable, they were displeased that he took upon him to reprimand them for their faults, and thus they threw themselves immediately into the public affairs, having never had any other design but that. The usual companions of Socrates were Crito, Xenophon, Socrates, Simmias, Cebes, and Phaston. and some others, none of whom frequented him that they might learn to speak eloquently, either in the assemblies of the people or in the courts of justice before the judges, but that they might become better men, and know how to behave themselves towards their domestics, their relations, their friends, and their fellow citizens. All these persons led very innocent lives, and whether we consider them in their youth or examine their behavior in a more advanced age, we shall find that they never were guilty of any bad action, nay, that they never gave the least ground to suspect them of being so. But the accuser says that Socrates encouraged children to despise their parents, making them believe that he was more capable to instruct them than they, and telling them that as the laws permit a man to chain his own father if he can convict him of lunacy, so, in like manner, it is but just that a man of excellent sense should throw another into chains who has not so much understanding. Not deny that Socrates may have said something like this, but he meant it not in the sense in which the accuser would have it taken, and he fully discovered what his meaning by those words was, when he said that he who should pretend to chain others because of their ignorance ought for the same reason to submit to be chained himself by men who know more than he. Hence it is that he argued so often at the difference between folly and ignorance, and then he plainly said that fools and madmen ought to be chained indeed, as well for their own interest as for that of their friends, but that they who are ignorant of things they should know ought only to be instructed by those that understand them. The accuser goes on that Socrates did not only teach men to despise their parents, but their other relations too, because he said that if a man be sick or have a suit in law, it is not his relations but the physicians or the advocates who are of use to him. He further alleged that Socrates, speaking of friends, said it was to no purpose to bear goodwill to any man, if it be not in our power to serve him, and that the only friends whom we ought to value are they who know what is good for us, and can teach it to us. Thus, says the accuser, Socrates, by persuading the youth that he was the wisest of all men, and the most capable to set others in the right road to wisdom, made them believe that all the rest of mankind were nothing in comparison with him. I remember indeed to have heard him sometimes talk after this manner of parents, relations, and friends, and he observed besides, if I mistake not, that when the soul in which the understanding resides is gone out of the body, we soon bury the corpse. And even though it be that of our nearest relation, we endeavor to put it out of our sight as soon as decently we can. Farther, though every man loves his own body to a great degree, scruple not nevertheless to take from it all that is superfluous. For this reason we cut our hair and our nails, we take off our corns and our warts, we put ourselves into the surgeon's hands and endure caustics and incisions, and after they have made us suffer a great deal of pain, we think ourselves obliged to give them a reward. Thus, too, we spit because the spittle is of no use to our mouth, but on the contrast is troublesome. But Socrates meant not by these or the like sayings to conclude that a man ought to bury his father alive, or that we ought to cut off our legs and arms, but he meant only to teach us what is useless is contemptible, and to exhort every man to improve and render himself useful to others, to the end that if we desire to be esteemed by our father, our brother, or any other relation, we should not rely so much on our parentage and consanguinity, as not to endeavor to render ourselves always useful to those whose esteem we desire to obtain. The accuser says further against Socrates that he was so malicious as to choose out of the famous poets the passages that contained the worst instructions, and that he made use of them in a sly manner, to inculcate the vices of injustice and violence, as this verse of Hesiod, "Blame no employment, but blame idleness." And he pretends that Socrates alleged this passage to prove that the poet meant to say that we ought not to count our employment unjust or dishonorable, if we can make an advantage of it. This, however, was far from the thoughts of Socrates, but, as he had always taught that employment and business are useful and honorable to men, and that idleness is an evil, he concluded that they who busy themselves about anything that is good are indeed employed, but that gamesters and debauched persons, and all who have no occupations, but such as are hurtful and wicked, are idle. Now, in this sense, is it not true to say, blame no employment, but blame idleness? The accuser likewise says that Socrates often repeated out of Homer a speech of Ulysses, and from thence he concludes that Socrates taught that the poet advised to beat the poor and abuse the common people. But it is plain Socrates could never have drawn such a wild and unnatural inference from those verses of the poet, because he would have argued against himself, since he was as poor as anyone besides. What he meant, therefore, was only this, that such as are neither men of counsel nor execution, who are neither fit to advise in the city nor to serve in the army, and are nevertheless proud and insolent, ought to be brought to reason, even though they be possessed of great riches. And this was the true meaning of Socrates, for he loved the men of low condition, and expressed a great civility for all sorts of persons, insomuch that whenever he was consulted, either by the Athenians or by foreigners, he would never take anything of any man for the instructions he gave them, but imparted his wisdom freely and without reward to all the world, while they, who became rich by his liberality, did not afterwards behave themselves too generously, but sold very dear to others what had cost them nothing, and, not being so obliged to temper as he, would not impart their knowledge to any who had it not in their power to reward them. In short, Socrates had rendered the city of Athens famous throughout the whole earth, and, as Lycus was said to be the honor of Sparta, because he treated at his own expense all the foreigners who came to the feasts of the Gymnopaides, so it may with much great reason be said of Socrates that he was the glory of Athens, he who all his life made continual distribution of his goodness and virtues, and who, keeping open for all the world the treasures of an inestimable wealth, never sent any man out of his company but more virtuous, and more improved in the principles of honor than formerly he was. Therefore, in my opinion, if he had been treated according to his merit, they should have decreed him public honors rather than have condemned him to an infamous death. For against whom have the laws ordained the punishment of death? Is it not for thieves, for robbers, for men guilty of sacrilege, for those who sell persons that are free? But where in all the world can we find a man more innocent for all of those crimes than Socrates? Can it be said of him that he ever held correspondence with the enemy, that he ever fomented any sedition, that he ever was the cause of a rebellion, or any other the like mischiefs? Can any man lay to his charge that he ever detained his estate, to him or it the least injury? Was he ever so much as suspected of any of these things? How then is it possible he should be guilty of the crimes of which he was accused, since instead of not believing in the gods, as the accuser says, it is manifest he was a sincere adorer of them? Instead of corrupting the youth, as he further alleges against him, he made it his chief care to deliver his friends from the power of every guilty passion, and to inspire them with an ardent love for virtue, the glory, the ornament, and felicity of families as well as of states. And this being fact, and fact it is, who can deny it? Is it not certain that the Republic was extremely obliged to him, and that she ought...
Section 3 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bish. Book 1, Chapter 3. How Socrates behaved throughout the whole of his life. Having therefore observed myself that all who frequented him improved themselves very much in his conversation, because he instructed them no less by his example than by his discourses, I am resolved to set down in this work all that I can recollect, both of his actions and words. First, then, as to what relates to the service of the gods, he strictly conformed to the advice of the oracle, who never gives any other answer to those who inquire of him in what manner they ought to sacrifice to the gods, or what honors they ought to render to the dead, than that every one should observe the customs of his own country. Thus, in all the acts of religious worship, Socrates took particular care to do nothing contrary to the custom of the Republic, and advised his friends to make that the rule of their devotion to the gods, alleging that it be an argument of superstition and vanity to dissent from the established worship. When he prayed to the gods, he besought them only to give him what is good, because they know better than we do what things are truly good for us. And he said that men who pray for silver, or for gold, or for the sovereign authority, made as foolish requests as if they prayed that they might play or fight, or desire any other thing whose event is uncertain, and that might be likely to turn to their disadvantage. When he offered sacrifices, he did not believe that his poverty rendered them despicable in the presence of the gods, and while he offered according to his ability, he thought he gave as much as the rich, who load the altars with costly gifts, for he held that it would be an injustice in the gods to take more delight in costly sacrifices than in poorer ones, because it would then follow that the offerings of the wicked would for the most part be more acceptable to them than the gifts of the good, and that, if this were so, we ought not to desire to live one moment longer. He thought, therefore, that nothing was so acceptable to the Deity as the homage that is paid him by souls truly pious and innocent. To this purpose he often repeated these verses: "Offer to heaven according to thy power. The indulgent, gracious gods require no more." And not only this, but in all the other occasions of life, he thought the best advice he could give his friends was to do all things according to their ability. When he believed that the gods had admonished him to do anything, it was as impossible to make him a contrary resolution as it would have been to have prevailed with him in a journey to change a guide that was clear-sighted for one that knew not the way, and was blind likewise. For this reason he pitied their folly who, to avoid the derision of men, lived not according to the admonitions and commands of the gods, and he beheld with contempt all the subtleties of human prudence when he compared them with divine inspirations. His way of living was such that whoever follows it may be assured, with the help of the gods, that he shall acquire a robust constitution and a health not to be easily impaired, and this too without any great expense, for he was content with so little that I believe there was not in all the world a man who could work at all but might have earned enough to have maintained him. He generally ate as long as he found pleasure in eating, and when he sat down to table he desired no other sauce but a sound appetite. All sorts of drink were alike pleasing to him, because he never drank but when he was thirsty, and if sometimes he was invited to a feast, he easily avoided eating and drinking to excess, which many find very difficult to do on those occasions. But he advised those who had no government of themselves never to taste of things that tempt a man to eat when he is no longer hungry, and that excite him to drink when his thirst is already quenched, because it is this that spoils the stomach, causes the headache, and puts the soul into disorder. And he said, between jest and earnest, that he believed it was with such meats as those that Circe changed men into swine, and that Ulysses avoided that transformation by the counsel of Mercury, and because he had temperance enough to abstain from tasting them. As to love, his advice was to avoid carefully the company of beautiful persons, saying it was very difficult to be near them and escape being taken in the snare. And having been told that Critobulus had given a kiss to the son of Alcibiades, who was a very handsome youth, he held this discourse to Xenophon, in the presence of Critobulus himself. Tell me, Xenophon, what opinion have you hither had of Critobulus? Have you placed him in the rank of the temperate and judicious, or with the debauched and imprudent? I have always looked upon him, answered Xenophon, to be a very virtuous and prudent man. Change your opinion, replied Socrates, and believe him more rash than if he threw himself on the points of naked swords or leapt into the fire. And what have you seen him do, said Xenophon, that gives you reason to speak thus of him? Why, he had the rashness, answered Socrates, to kiss the son of Alcibiades, who is so beautiful and charming. And this is all, said Xenophon. For my part, I think I could also willingly expose myself to the same danger that he did. Wretch that you are, replied Socrates, do you consider what happens to you after you have kissed a beautiful face? Do you not lose your liberty? Do you not become a slave? Do you not engage yourself in a vast expense to procure a sinful pleasure? Do you not find yourself in an incapacity of doing what is good, and that you subject yourself to the necessity of employing your whole time and person in the pursuit of what you would despise if your reason were not corrupted? Good God, replied Xenophon, This is ascribing a wonderful power to a kiss, forsooth. And you are surprised at it? Answered Socrates. Are there not some small animals whose bite is so venomous that it causes insufferable pain and even the loss of the senses? I know it very well, said Xenophon, but these animals leave a poison behind them when they sting. And do you think, you fool, added Socrates, that kisses of love are not venomous because you perceive not the poison? Know that a beautiful person is a more dangerous animal than scorpions, because these cannot wound unless they touch us, but beauty strikes at a distance. From what place soever we can but behold her, she darts her venom upon us, and overthrows our judgment. And perhaps for this reason the Loves are represented with bows and arrows, because a beautiful face wounds us from afar. I advise you therefore, Xenophon, when you chance to see a beauty, to fly from it without looking behind you. And for you, Critobulus, I think it convenient that you should enjoin yourself a year's absence, which will not be too long a time to heal you from your wound. As for such as have not the strength enough to resist the power of love, he thought that they ought to consider and use it as an action to which the soul would never consent, were it not for the necessity of the body, and which, though it be necessary, ought nevertheless to give us no inquietude. As for himself, his continence was well known to all men, and it was more easy for him to avoid courting the most celebrated beauties than it is for others to get away from disagreeable objects. Thus we see what was his way of life in eating, drinking, and in the affair of love. He believed, however, that he tasted of those pleasures no less than they who give themselves much trouble to enjoy them, but that he had not, like them, so frequent occasions for sorrow and repentance. End of section 3. Section 4 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bish. Book 1, Chapter 4. Socrates proveth the existence of a deity. If there be any who believe, what some have written by conjecture, that Socrates was indeed excellent in exciting men to virtue, but that he did not push them forward to make any great progress in it, let such reflect a little on what he said, not only when he endeavored to refute those that boasted they knew all things, but likewise in his familiar conversations, and let them judge afterwards if he was incapable to advance his friends in the paths of virtue. I will in the first place relate a conference which he had with Aristodemus, surnamed the Little, touching the deity, for he had heard that he never sacrificed to the gods, that he never addressed himself to them in prayer, that he never consulted the oracles, and even laughed at those that practised these things. He took him to talk in this manner: Tell me, Aristodemus, are there any persons whom you value on account of their merit? He answered, Yes, certainly. Tell me their names, added Socrates. Aristodemus replied, For epic poetry I admire Homer as the most excellent. For dithyrambics, Melanipides, Sophocles for tragedy, Polycletus for statuary, and Zeuxis for painting. Which artists, said Socrates, do you think to be most worthy of your esteem and admiration? They who make images without soul and motion, or they who make animals that move of their own accord, and are endowed with understanding? No doubt the last, replied Aristodemus, provided they make them not by chance, but with judgment and prudence. Socrates went on, as there are some things which we cannot say why they were made, and others which are apparently good and useful, tell me, my friend, whether of the two you rather take to be the work of prudence than of hazard. It is reasonable, said Aristodemus, to believe that the things which are good and useful are the workmanship of reason and judgment. Do not you think then, replied Socrates, that the first former of mankind designed their advantage when he gave them the several senses by which objects are apprehended, eyes for things visible, and ears for sounds? Of what advantage would agreeable scents have been to us if nostrils suited to their reception had not been given? And for the pleasures of the taste, how could we ever have enjoyed these if the tongue had not been fitted to discern and relish them? Further, does it not appear to you wisely provided that since the eye is of a delicate make, it is guarded with the eyelid drawn back when the eye is used, and covering it in sleep? How well does the hair at the extremity of the eyelid keep out dust, and the eyebrow, by its prominency, prevent the sweat of the forehead from running into the eye to its hurt? How wisely is the ear formed to receive all sorts of sounds, and not to be filled with any to the exclusion of others? Are not the 4 teeth of all animals fitted to cut off proper portions of food, and their grinders to reduce it to a convenient smallness? The mouth, by which we take in the food we like, is fitly placed just beneath the nose and eyes, the judges of its goodness; and what is offensive and disagreeable to our senses is, for that reason, placed at a proper distance from them. In short, these things being disposed in such order, and with so much care, can you hesitate one moment to determine whether it be an effect of Providence or of chance? I doubt not of it in the least, replied Aristodemus. And the more I fix my thoughts on the contemplation of these things, the more I am persuaded that all this is the masterpiece of a great workman, who bears an extreme love to men. What say you, continued Socrates, to this, that he gives all animals a desire to engender and propagate their kind, that he inspires the mothers with tenderness and affection to bring up their young, and that from the very hour of their birth he infuses into them this great love of life and this mighty aversion to death? I say, replied Aristodemus, that it is an effect of his great care for their preservation. This is not all, said Socrates. Answer me yet farther. Perhaps you would rather interrogate me. You are not, I persuade myself, ignorant that you are endowed with understanding. Do you then think that there is not elsewhere an intelligent being? Particularly if you consider that your body is only a little earth taken from that great mass which you behold. The moisture that composes you is only a small drop of that immense heap of water that makes the sea. In a word, your body contains only a small portion of all the elements, which are elsewhere in great quantity. There is nothing then but your understanding alone, which, by a wonderful piece of good fortune, must have come to you from I know not whence, if there were none in another place. And can it then be said that all this universe, and all these so vast and numerous bodies, have been disposed in so much order, without the help of an intelligent being, and by mere chance? I find it very difficult to understand it otherwise, answered Aristodemus, because I see not the gods, who, you say, make and govern all things, as I see the artificers who do any piece of work among us. Nor do you see your soul neither, answered Socrates, which governs your body. But because you do not see it, will you from thence infer you do nothing at all by its direction, but that everything you do is by mere chance? Aristodemus, now wavering, said, I do not despise the Deity, but I conceive such an idea of his magnificence and self-sufficiency that I imagine him to have no need of me or my services. You are quite wrong, said Socrates. For by how much the gods, who are so magnificent, vouchsafe to regard you, by so much you are bound to praise and adore them. It is needless for me to tell you, answered Aristodemus, that if I believed the gods interested themselves in human affairs, I should not neglect to worship them. How? Replied Socrates. You do not believe the gods take care of men, they who have not only given to man in common with other animals the senses of seeing, hearing, and taste, but have also given him to walk upright, a privilege which no other animal can boast of, and which is of mighty use to him to look forward to remote objects, to survey with facility those above him, and to defend himself from any harm. Besides, although the animals that walk have feet, which serve them for no other use than to walk, yet herein have the gods distinguished men, in that, besides feet, they have given him hands, the instruments of 1,000 grand and useful actions, on which account he not only excels, but is happier than all animals besides. And further, though all animals have tongues, yet none of them can speak like man's. His tongue only can form words, by which he declares his thoughts and communicates them to others, not to mention smaller instances of their care, such as the concern they take of our pleasures, in confining men to no certain season for the enjoying them, as they have done other animals. But Providence taketh care, not only of our bodies, but of our souls. It hath pleased the great Author of all, not only to give man so many advantages for the body, but, which is the greatest gift of all, and the strongest proof of his care, he hath breathed into him an intelligent soul, and that, too, the most excellent of all. For which of the other animals has a soul that knows the being of the Deity, by whom so many great and marvellous works are done? Is there any species but man that serves and adores him? Which of the animals can, like him, protect himself from hunger and thirst, from heat and cold? Which, like him, can find remedies for diseases, can make use of his strength, and is as capable of learning, that so perfectly retains the things he has seen, he has heard, he has known? In a word, it is manifest that man is a god in comparison with the other living species, considering the advantages he naturally has over them, both of body and soul. For if man had a body like that of an ox, the subtlety of his understanding would avail him nothing, because he would not be able to execute what he should project. On the other hand, if that animal had a body like ours, yet being devoid of understanding, he would be no better than the rest of the brute species. Thus the gods have at once united in your person the most excellent structure of body and the greatest perfection of soul. And now can you still say, after all, that they take no care of you? What would you have them do to convince you of the contrary? I would have them, answered Aristodemus, send on purpose to let me know expressly all that I ought to do or not to do, in like manner as you say they do give you notice. What? said Socrates. When they pronounce any oracle to all the Athenians, do you think they do not address themselves to you too, when by prodigies they make known to the Greeks the things that are to happen? Are they silent to you alone, and are you the only person they neglect? Do you think that the gods would have instilled this notion into men, that it is they who can make them happy or miserable, if it were not indeed in their power to do so? And do you believe that the human race would have been thus long abused without ever discovering the cheat? Do you not know that the most ancient and wisest republics and people have been also the most pious, and that man, at the age when his judgment is ripest, has then the greatest bent to the worship of the Deity? My dear Aristodemus, consider that your mind governs your body according to its pleasure. In like manner we ought to believe that there is a mind diffused throughout the whole universe, that disposeth all things according to its counsels. You must not imagine that your weak sight can reach the objects that are several leagues distant, and that the eye of God cannot, at one and the same time, see all things. You must not imagine that your mind can reflect on the affairs of Athens, of Egypt, and of Sicily, and that the providence of God cannot, at one and the same moment, consider all things. As, therefore, you may make trial of the gratitude of a man by doing him a kindness, and as you may discover his prudence by consulting him in difficult affairs, so, if you would be convinced how great is the power and goodness of God, apply yourself sincerely to piety and his worship. Then, my dear Aristodemus, you shall soon be persuaded that the Deity sees all, hears all, is present everywhere, and at the same time regulates and superintends all the events of the universe. By such discourses as these Socrates taught his friends never to commit any injustice or dishonorable action, not only in the presence of men, but even in secret, and when they are alone, since the Divinity hath always an eye over us, and none of our actions can be hid from him. Section 5
of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Elfman. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. Translated by Edward Bishey. Book 1, Chapter 5. The Praise of Temperance. And if temperance be a virtue in man, as undoubtedly it is, let us see whether any improvement can be made by what he said of it. I will here give you one of his discourses on the subject. If we were engaged in a war, said he, and were to choose a general, what would we make choice of a man given to wine or women, and who could not support fatigues and hardships? Could we believe that such a commander would be capable to defend us and to conquer our enemies? Or if we were lying on our deathbed, and were to appoint a guardian and tutor to our children, to take care to instruct our sons in the principles of virtue, to breed up our daughters in the paths of honor, and to be faithful in the management of their fortunes, should we think a debauched person fit for that employment? Would we trust our flocks and our granaries in the hands of a drunkard? Would we rely upon him for the conduct of any enterprise? And in short, if the present were made us such a slave, should we not make it a difficulty to accept him? If, then, we have so great an aversion for debauchery in the person of the meanest servant, ought we not ourselves to be very careful not to fall into the same fault? Besides, a covetous man has the satisfaction of enriching himself, and, though he take away another's estate, he increases his own. But a debauched man is both troublesome to others and injurious to himself. We may say of him that he is hurtful to all the world, and yet so more hurtful to himself, if to ruin, not only his family, but his body and soul likewise, is to be hurtful. Who, then, can take delight in the company of him who has no other diversion than eating and drinking, and who is better pleased with the conversation of a prostitute than of his friends? Ought we not, then, to practice temperance above all things, seeing it is the foundation of all other virtues? For without it what can we learn that is good? What do that is worthy of praise? Is not the state of a man who is plunged into voluptuousness a wretched condition both for the body and the soul? Certainly, in my opinion, a free person ought to wish to have no such servants, and servants addicted to such brutal regularities ought earnestly to entreat heaven that they may fall into the hands of very indulgent masters, because their ruin will be otherwise almost unavoidable. This is what Socrates was wont to say upon this subject. But if he appeared to be a lover of temperance in his discourses, he was yet a more exact observer of it in his actions, showing himself to be not only invincible to the pleasures of the senses, but even deprived himself of the satisfaction of getting an estate. For he held that a man who accepts money from others makes himself a servant to all their humours, and becomes their slave in a manner no less scandalous than other slaveries. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Elfman. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. Translated by Edward Beashey. Book 1, Chapter 6. The Dispute of Socrates with Xenophon, the Sophist. To this end, it will not be amiss to relate, for the honour of Socrates, what passed between him and the sophist Xenophon, who designed to seduce away his hearers, and to that end came to him when they were with him, and, in their presence, addressed himself to him in these words. I imagined, Socrates, that philosophers were happier than other men, but in my opinion your wisdom renders you more miserable, for you live at such a rate that no footman would live with a master that treated him in the same manner. You eat and drink poorly, you are clothed very meanly. The same suit serves you in the summer and winter, and you go barefoot. For all this you take no money, although it is a pleasure to get it, for after a man has acquired it, he lives more genteelly, and more at his ease. If, therefore, as in all other sorts of arts, apprentices endeavour to imitate their masters, should these who frequent your conversation become like you, it is certain that you will have taught them nothing but to make themselves miserable. Socrates answered him in the following manner. You think, Xenophon, I live so poorly that I believe you would rather die than live like me. But what is it that you find so strange and difficult in my way of living? You blame me for not taking money? Is it because those who take money are obliged to do what they promise? And that I, who take none, entertain myself only with whom I think fit? You despise my eating and drinking. Is it because my diet is not so good, nor so nourishing as yours, or because it is that more scarce and dearer, or lastly, because your fare seems to do you better? Know that a man who likes what he eats needs no other ragout, and that he who finds one sort of drink pleasant wishes for no other. As to your objection of my clothes, you appear to me, Xenophon, to judge quite amiss of the matter. Do you not know that we dress ourselves differently only because of the hot or cold weather, and if we wear shoes it is because we would walk the easier? But tell me, did you ever observe that the cold hath hindered me from going abroad? Have you ever seen me choose the cool and fresh shades in hot weather? And though I go barefoot, do you not see that I go wherever I will? Do you not know that there are some persons of a very tender constitution, who, by constant exercise, surmount the weaknesses of their nature, and at length endure fatigues better than they who are naturally more robust, but have not taken pains to exercise and harden themselves like the others? Thus, therefore, do you not believe that I, who have all my life accustomed myself to bear patiently all manner of fatigues, cannot now more easily submit to this than you, who have never thought of the matter? If I have no keen desire after dainties, if I sleep little, if I abandon not myself to any infamous amour, the reason is because I spend my time more delightfully in these things whose pleasure ends not in the moment of enjoyment, and that make me hope besides to receive an everlasting reward. Besides, you know very well that when a man sees that his affairs go ill, he is not generally very gay, that on the contrary they who think to succeed in their designs, whether in agriculture, traffic, or any other undertaking, are very contented in their minds. Now do you think that for anything whatsoever that can precede a satisfaction equal to the inward consciousness of improving daily in virtue and acquiring the acquaintanceship and friendship of the best of men? And if we were to serve our friends or our country, would not a man who lives like me be more capable of it than one who should follow that course of life which you take to be so charming? If it were necessary to carry arms, which of the two would be the best soldier? He who must always fare deliciously, or he who would satisfy with what he finds? If they were to undergo a siege, who would hold out longest? He who could not live without delicacies, or he who requires nothing but what may easily be had? One would think, Xenophon, that you believe happiness to consist in good eating and drinking, and in an expensive and splendid way of life. For my part, I am of the opinion that to have need of nothing at all is a divine perfection, and that to have need but of little is to approach very near the deity. And hence it follows that, as there is nothing more excellent than the deity, whatever approaches nearest to it, likewise most near the supreme excellence. Another time Xenophon addressed himself to Socrates. I confess you an honest, well-meaning man, Socrates, but it is certain you know little or nothing, and one would imagine you own this to be true, for you get nothing by your teaching, and yet I persuade myself you would not part with your house or any of the furniture of it without some gratuity, because you believe them of some small value. Nay, you would not part with them for less than they are worth. If, therefore, you thought your teaching worth anything, you would be paid for it according to its value. In this, indeed, you show yourself honest, because you will not out of avarice cheat any man, but at the same time you discover, too, that you know but little, since all your knowledge is not worth the buying. Socrates answered him in this manner. There is a great resemblance between beauty and the doctrine of philosophers. What is praiseworthy is the one that is so in the other, and both of them are subject to the same vice. For if a woman sells her beauty for money, we immediately call her a prostitute. But if she knows that a man of worth and condition has fallen in love with her, and if she makes him her friend, we say she is a prudent woman. It is just the same with the doctrine of philosophers. They that sell it are sophists, and like the public women. But a philosopher observe a youth of excellent parts, and teacheth him what he knows, in order to obtain his friendship. We say of him that he acts the part of a good and virtuous citizen. Thus, as such delight in fine horses, others in dogs, and others in birds, for my part, all my delight is to be with my virtuous friends. I teach them all the good I know, and recommend them to all those who I believe capable to assist them in the way of perfection. We all draw together, out of the same fountain, the precious treasures which the ancient sages have left us. We run over their works, and if we find anything excellent, we take notice of it and select it. In short, we believe we have made a great improvement when we begin to love one another. This was the answer he made, and when I heard him speak in this manner, I thought him very happy, and that he effectually stirred up his hearers to the love of virtue. Another time, when Xenophon asked him why he did not concern himself with the affairs of state, seeing he thought himself capable to make others good politicians, he returned this answer. Should I be more serviceable to the state if I took an employment whose function would be wholly bounded in my person, and take up all of my time, than I am by instructing everyone as I do, and in furnishing the Republic with great number of citizens who are capable to serve her? End of Section 6.
Section 7 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scheib. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. Translated by Edward Beisch. Book 2, Chapter 1. A Conference of Socrates with Aristippus concerning pleasure and temperance. In the same manner, likewise, he encouraged his hearers by the following arguments to support hunger and thirst, to resist the temptations of love, to fly from laziness and inure themselves to all manner of fatigues. For, being told that one of them lived too luxuriously, he asked him this question. If you were entrusted, Aristippus, with the education of two young men, one to be a prince and the other a private man, how would you educate them? Let us begin with their nourishment, as being the foundation of all. It is true, said Aristippus, that nourishment is the foundation of our life, for a man must soon die if he be not nourished. You would accustom both of them, said Socrates, to eat and drink at a certain hour? It's likely I should. But which of the two, said Socrates, would you teach to leave eating before he was satisfied, to go about some earnest business? Him without doubt, answered Aristippus, whom I intended to render capable to govern, to the end that under him the affairs of the Republic might not suffer by delay. Which of the two, continued Socrates, would you teach to abstain from drinking when he was thirsty, to sleep but little, to go late to bed, to rise early, to watch whole nights, to live chastely, to get the better of his favorite inclinations, and not to avoid fatigues, but expose himself freely to them. The same still, replied Aristippus. And if there be any art that teaches to overcome our enemies, to which of the two is it rather reasonable to teach it? To him too, said Aristippus, for without that art all the rest would avail him nothing. I believe, said Socrates, that a man who has been educated in this manner would not suffer himself to be so easily surprised by his enemies as the most part of animals do. For some perish by their gluttony, as those whom we allure with a bait, or catch by offering them to drink, and who fall into the snares, notwithstanding the fears and distrust. Others perish through their lasciviousness, as quails and partridges, who suffer themselves to be decoyed by the counterfeit voice of their females, and blindly following the amorous warmth that transports them, fall miserably into the nets. You say true, said Aristippus. Well then, pursued Socrates, is it not scandalous for a man to be taken in the same snares with irrational animals? And does not this happen to adulterers, who skulk and hide themselves in the chambers and closets of married women, though they know they run a very great risk, and that the laws are very strict and rigorous against those crimes? They know themselves to be watched, and that, if they are taken, they shall not be let go with impunity. In a word, they see punishment and infamy hanging over the heads of criminals like themselves. Besides, they are not ignorant that there are 1,000 honorable diversions to deliver them from those infamous passions, and yet they run hand over head into the midst of these dangers. And what is this but to be wretched and desperate to the highest degree?
I think it so, said Aristippus.
What say you to this, continued Socrates, that the most necessary and important affairs of life, as those of war and husbandry, are, with others of little less consequence, performed in the fields and in the open air, and that the greatest part of mankind accustom themselves so little to endure the inclemency of the seasons, to suffer heat and cold? Is not this a great neglect? And do you not think that a man who is to command others ought to inure himself to all these hardships? I think he ought, answered Aristippus. Therefore, replied Socrates, if they who are patient and laborious, as we have said, are worthy to command, may we not say that they who can do nothing of all this ought never pretend to any office? Aristippus agreed to it, and Socrates went on. Since then you know the rank which either of these two sorts of men ought to hold, amongst which would you have us place you? Me, said Aristippus. Why, truly not amongst those that govern, for this is an office I would never choose. Let those rule who have a mind for it. For my part, I envy not their condition. For when I reflect that we find it hard enough to supply our own wants, I do not approve of loading ourselves, besides, with the necessities of a whole people, and that, being often compelled to go without many things that we desire, we should engage ourselves in an employment that would render us liable to blame if we did not take care to supply others with everything they want. I think there is folly in all this, for republics make use of their magistrates as I do of my slaves. Who shall get me my meat and drink, and all other necessities, as I command, and not presume to touch any of it themselves? So, too, the people will have those who govern the state take care to provide them with plenty of all things, and will not suffer them to do anything for their own advantage. I think, therefore, that all who are pleased with the hurry of affairs, and in creating business for others, are most fit to govern, provided they have been educated and instructed in the manner we mentioned. But, for my part, I desire to lead a more quiet and easy life. Let us, said Socrates, consider whether they who govern lead more happy lives than their subjects. Among the nations that are known to us in Asia, the Syrians, the Phrygians, and the Lydians are under the empire of the Persians. In Europe, the Mauritians are subject to the Scythians. In Africa, the Carthaginians reign over the rest of the Africans. Which now, in your opinion, are the most happy? Let us look into Greece, where you are at present. Whose condition, think you, is most to be desired? That of the nations who rule, or of the people who are under the dominion of others? I can never, said Aristippus, consent to be a slave. But there is a way between both that leads neither to empire nor subjection, and this is the road of liberty, in which I endeavor to walk, because it is the shortest to arrive at true quiet and repose. If you had said, replied Socrates, that this way, which leads neither to empire nor subjection, is a way that leads far from all human society, you would, perhaps, have said something. For how can we live among men and neither command nor obey? Do you not observe that the mighty oppress the weak, and use them as their slaves, after they have made them groan under the weight of oppression, and given them just cause to complain of their cruel usage, in 1,000 instances, both general and particular? And if they find any who will not submit to the yoke, they ravage their countries, spoil their corn, cut down their trees, and attack them, in short, in such a manner that they are compelled to yield themselves up to slavery, rather than undergo so unequal a war. Among private men themselves, do not the stronger and more bold trample on the weaker? To the end, therefore, that this may not happen to me, said Aristippus, I confine myself not to any republic, but in sometimes here, sometimes there, and think it best to be a stranger wherever I am. This invention of yours, replied Socrates, is very extraordinary. Travelers, I believe, are not now so much infested on the roads by robbers as formerly, deterred, I suppose, by the fate of Sinis, Scyron, Procrustes, and the rest of that gang. What then? They who are settled in their own country, and are concerned in the administration of the public affairs, they have the laws in their favors, have their relations and friends to assist them, have fortified towns and arms for their defense. Over and above, they have alliances with their neighbors, and yet all these favorable circumstances cannot entirely shelter them from the attempts and surprises of wicked men. But can you, who have none of these advantages, who are, for the most part, traveling on the roads, often dangerous to most men, who never enter a town, where you have not less credit than the meanest inhabitant, and are obscure as the wretches who prey on the properties of others, in these circumstances, can you, I say, expect to be safe merely because you are a stranger, or perhaps have got passports from the states that promise you all manner of safety coming or going? Or should it be your hard fortune to be made a slave, you would make such a bad one that a master would be never the better for you? For who would suffer in his family a man who would not work, and yet expect to live well? But let us see how masters use such servants. When they are too lascivious, they compel them to fast, till they have brought them so low that they have no great stomach to make love. If they are thieves, they prevent them from stealing by carefully locking up whatever they could take. They chain them for fear they should run away. If they are dull and lazy, then stripes and scourges are the rewards we give them. If you yourself, my friend, had a worthless slave, would you not take the same measures with him? I would treat such a fellow, answered Aristippus, with all manner of severity, till I had brought him to serve me better. But, Socrates, let us resume our former discourse. In what do they, who are educated in the art of government, which you seem to think a great happiness, differ from those who suffer through necessity? For you say they must accustom themselves to hunger and thirst, to endure cold and heat, to sleep little, and that they must voluntarily expose themselves to 1,000 other fatigues and hardships. Now, I cannot conceive what difference there is between being whipped willingly and by force, and tormenting one's body either one way or the other, except that it is a folly in a man to be willing to suffer pain. How, said Socrates, you know not the difference between things voluntary and constrained, that he who suffers hunger because he is pleased to do so may likewise eat when he has a mind, and he who suffers thirst because he is willing may also drink when he pleases. But it is not in the power of him who suffers either of them through constraint and necessity to relieve himself by eating and drinking the moment he desires it. Besides, he that voluntarily embraceth any laborious exercise finds much comfort and content in the hope that animates him. Thus, the fatigues of hunting discourage not the hunters, because they hope to take the game they pursue. And yet what they take, though they think it a reward for all their toil, is certainly of very little value. Ought not they, then, who labor to gain the friendship of good men, or to overcome their enemies, or to render themselves capable of governing their families, and of serving their country, ought not these, I say, joyfully to undertake the trouble, and to rest content, conscious of the inward approbation of their own minds, and the regard and the esteem of the virtuous? And to convince you that it is good to impose labors on ourselves, it is a maxim amongst those who instruct youth that the exercises which are easily performed at the first attempt, and which we immediately take delight in, are not capable to form the body to that vigor and strength that is requisite in great undertakings, nor of imprinting in the soul any considerable knowledge, but that those which require patience, application, labor, and assiduity prepare the way to illustrious actions and great achievements. This is the opinion of good judges, and of Hesiod in particular, who says somewhere, "To vice, in crowded ranks the course we steer, the road is smooth and her abode is near, but virtue's heights are reached with sweat and pain. For thus did the immortal powers ordain, a long and rough ascent leads to her gate, nor, till the summit's gained, doth toil abate." And to the same purpose Epicharmus, "The gods confer their blessing at the price of labor," who remarks in another place, "Thou son of sloth, avoid the charms of ease, lest pain succeed." Of the same opinion is Prodicus, in the book he has written of the life of Hercules, where virtue and pleasure make their court to that hero under their appearance of two beautiful women. His words, as near I can remember, are as follows. "When Hercules," says the moralist, "had arrived at that part of his youth in which young men commonly choose for themselves, and show, by the result of their choice, whether they will, through the succeeding stages of their lives, enter into and walk in the path of virtue or that of vice, he went out into a solitary place fit for contemplation, there to consider with himself which of those two paths he should pursue. As he was sitting there in suspense, he saw two women of a larger stature than ordinary approaching towards him. One of them had a genteel and amiable aspect. Her beauty was natural and easy, her person and shape clean and handsome, her eyes cast towards the ground with an agreeable reserve, her motion and behavior full of modesty, and her raiment white as snow. The other wanted all the native beauty and proportion of the former. Her person was swelled by luxury and ease, to a size quite disproportioned and uncomely. She had painted her complexion, that it might seem fairer and more ruddy than it really was, and endeavored to appear more graceful than ordinary in her mien, by a mixture of affectation in all her gestures. Her eyes were full of confidence, and her dress transparent, that the conceited beauty of her person might appear through it to advantage. She cast her eyes frequently upon herself, then turned them on those that were present, to see whether anyone regarded her, and now and then looked on the figure she made in her own shadow. As they drew nearer, the former continued the same composed pace, while the latter, striving to get before her, ran up to Hercules, and addressed herself to him in the following manner. "I perceive, my dear Hercules, you are in doubt which path in life you should pursue. If, then, you will be my friend and follow me, I will lead you to a path the most easy and most delightful, wherein you shall taste all the sweets of life, and live exempt from every trouble. You shall neither be concerned in war, nor in the affairs of the world, but shall only consider how to gratify all your senses, your taste with the finest dainties and most delicious drink, your sight with the most agreeable objects, your scent with the richest perfumes and fragrancy of odors, how you may enjoy the embraces of the fair, repose on the softest beds, render your slumbers sweet and easy, and by what means enjoy, without even the smallest care, all of those glorious and mighty blessings. And, for fear you suspect that the sources whence you are to derive these invaluable blessings might at some time or other fail, and that you might, of course, be obliged to acquire them at some expense of your mind and the united labor and fatigue of your body, I beforehand assure you that you shall freely enjoy all from the industry of others, undergo neither hardship nor drudgery, but have everything at your command that can afford you any pleasure or advantage." Hercules, hearing the lady make him such offers, desired to know her name, to which she answered, "My friends, and those who are well acquainted with me, and whom I have conducted, call me Happiness. But my enemies, and those who would injure my reputation, have given me the name of pleasure. In the meantime, the other lady approached, and in her turn accosted him in this manner. I also am come to you, Hercules, to offer my assistance. I, who am well acquainted with your divine extraction, and have observed the excellence of your nature, even from your childhood, from which I have reason to hope that, if you would follow the path that leadeth to my residence, you will undertake the greatest enterprises, and achieve the most glorious actions, and that I shall thereby become more honorable and illustrious among mortals. But before I invite you into my society and friendship, I will be open and sincere with you, and must lay down this as an established truth, that there is nothing truly valuable which can be purchased without pains and labor. The gods have set a price upon every real and noble pleasure. If you would gain the favor of the deity, you must be at the pains of worshipping him. If you would be beloved by your friends, you must study to oblige them. If you would be honored by any city, you must be of service to it. And if you would be admired by all Greece, on account of your probity and valor, you must exert yourself to do her some eminent service. If you would render your fields fruitful and fill your arms with corn, you must labor to cultivate the soil accordingly. Would you grow rich by your herds, a proper care must be taken of them. Would you extend your dominions by arms, and be rendered capable of setting at liberty your captive friends, and bringing your enemies to subjection, you must not only learn of those that are experienced in the art of war, but exercise yourself also in the use of military affairs. And if you would excel in the strength of your body, you must keep your body in due subjection to your mind, and exercise it with labor and pains. Here pleasure broke in upon her discourse. Do you see, my dear Hercules, through what long and difficult ways this woman would lead you to her promised delights? Follow me, and I will show you a much shorter and much easier way to happiness. Alas, replied the goddess of virtue, whose visage glowed with a passion made up of scorn and pity, what happiness can you bestow, or what pleasure can you taste, who would never do anything to acquire it? You who will take your fill of all pleasures before you feel an appetite for any. You eat before you are hungry. You drink before you are athirst, and, that you may please your taste, must have the finest artists to prepare your viands, the richest wines that you may drink with pleasure, and to give your wine the finer taste you search every place for ice and snow luxuriously to cool it in the heat of summer. Then, to make your slumbers uninterrupted, you must have the softest down and the easiest couches, and a gentle ascent of steps, to save you from any of the least disturbance in mounting up to them. And all little enough, heaven knows, for you have not prepared yourself for sleep by anything you have done, but seek after it only because you have nothing to do. It is the same in the enjoyment of love, in which you rather force than follow your inclinations, and are obliged to use arts, and even to pervert nature to keep your passions alive. Thus it is that you instruct your followers, kept awake for the greatest part of the night by debaucheries, and consuming in drowsiness all the most useful part of the day. Though immortal, you are an outcast from the gods, and despised by good men. Never have you heard that most agreeable of all sounds, your own praise, nor ever have you beheld the most pleasing of all objects, any good work of your own hands. Who would ever give any credit to anything you say? Who would assist you in your necessity? Or what man of sense would ever venture to be of your mad parties? Such as do follow you are robbed of their strength when they are young, void of wisdom when they grow old. In their youth they are bred up in indolence and all manner of delicacy, and pass their old age with difficulties and distress, full of shame for what they have done, and oppressed with the burden of what they are to do, squanderers of pleasures in their youth, and hoarders up of afflictions for their old age. On the contrary, my conversation is with the gods, and with good men, and there is nothing excellent performed by either without my influence. I am respected above all things by the gods, and by the best of mortals, and it is just I should. I am an agreeable companion to the artisan, a faithful security to masters of families, a kind assistant to servants, a useful associate in the arts of peace, a faithful ally in the labors of war, and the best uniter of all friendships. My votaries, too, enjoy a pleasure in everything they either eat or drink, even without having labored for it, because they wait for the demand of their appetites. Their sleep is sweeter than that of the indolent and inactive, and they are neither overburdened with it when they awake, nor do they, for the sake of it, omit the necessary duties of life. My young men have the pleasure of being praised by those who are in years, and those who are in years of being honored by those who are young. They look back with comfort on their past actions, and delight themselves in the present employments. By my means they are favored by the gods, beloved by their friends, and honored by their country, and when the appointed period of their lives is come, they are not lost in a dishonorable oblivion, but live and flourish in the praises of mankind, even to the latest posterity. Thus, my dear Hercules, who are descended of divine ancestors, you may acquire, by virtuous toil and industry, this most desirable state of perfect happiness. Such was the discourse, my friend, which the goddess had with Hercules, according to Prodicus. You may believe that he embellished the thoughts with more noble expressions than I do. I heartily wish, my dear Aristippus, that you should make such an improvement of those divine instructions, as that you too may make such a happy choice as may render you happy during the future course of your life. End of Section 7. Recording by Scheib.
Section 8 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Elfman. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. Translated by Edward Beashey. Book 1, Chapter 7. In what manner Socrates dissuaded men from self-conceit and ostentation. But let us now see whether by dissuading his friends from a vain ostentation he did not exhort them to the pursuit of virtue. He frequently said that there was no readier way to glory than to render oneself excellent, and not to affect to appear so. To prove this, he alleged the following example. Let us suppose, he said, that any one would be thought a good musician without being so in reality. What course must he take? He must be careful to imitate the great masters in everything that is not of their art. He must, like them, have fine musical instruments. He must, like them, be followed by a great number of persons wherever he goes, who must be always talking in his praise. And yet he must not venture to sing in public, for then all men would immediately perceive not only his ignorance, but his presumption and folly likewise. And would it not be ridiculous in him to spend his estate to ruin his reputation? In like manner, if any one would appear a great general or a good pilot, though he knew nothing of the either, what would be the issue of it? And if he cannot make others believe it, it troubles him. And if he can persuade them to think so, he is yet more unhappy, because, if he be made choice of for the steering of ships, or to command an army, he would acquit himself very ill of this office, and perhaps be the cause of the loss of his best friends. It is not less dangerous to appear to be rich, or brave, or strong, if we are not so indeed, for this opinion of us may procure us employments that are above our capacity, and if we fail to effect what was expected of us, there is no remission of our faults. And if it be a great cheat to wheedle one of your neighbors out of any of his ready money or goods, and not restore them to him afterwards, it is a much greater impudence and cheat for a worthless fellow to persuade the world that he is capable to govern a republic. By these and the like arguments he inspired a hatred of vanity and ostentation into the minds of those who frequented him. End of Section 8. Section 9 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Elfman. Book 2, Chapter 2. Socrates' Discourse with his eldest son, Lamprocles, concerning the respect due to parents. Socrates, observing his eldest son, Lamprocles, in a rage with his mother, spoke to him in this manner. Come hither, my son. Have you ever heard of a certain sort of men who are called ungrateful? Very often, answered the young man. And, do you know, said Socrates, why they are called so? We call a man ungrateful, answered Lamprocles, who, having received a kindness, does not return the like if occasion offers. I think, therefore, said Socrates, ingratitude is a kind of injustice. I think so too, answered Lamprocles. Socrates went on. Have you never considered what nature this injustice is? For since it is an injustice to treat our friends ill, and on the contrary a piece of justice to make our enemies smart for their conduct, may it be said, with like reason, that it is an injustice to be ungrateful towards our friends, and that it is just to be ungrateful towards our enemies? On mature consideration, answered Lamprocles, I think it is criminal to do injustice to either of them. If then, pursued Socrates, ingratitude be an injustice, it follows that the greater the favors are which we have received, the greater is the injustice in not acknowledging them. Lamprocles granted this consequence, and Socrates continued. Can there be any stricter obligations than those that children are laid under to their parents? For it is they who gave them a being, and who have put them in a condition to behold all the wonders of nature, and to partake of the many good things exhibited before them by the bounty of Providence, and which are so delightful, that there is not anything that all men more dread than to leave them, insomuch that all governments have ordained death to be the punishment of the most enormous crimes, because there's nothing can more effectually put a stop to the rage of the wicked than the apprehension of death. In the affair of marriage, it is not merely the gratification of the appetite which nature has so strongly implanted in both sexes for their preservation that we regard. No, that passion can be satisfied in a less expensive manner, even in our streets and other places, but when we design to enter into that state, we make choice of a woman of such a form and shape, by whom we may expect to have fine children, and of such a temper and disposition as to assure us of future happiness. When that is finished, it is then the chief care of the husband to maintain his wife, and to provide for his children things useful for life in the greatest abundance he can. On part of the wife, many of her anxieties and troubles for the preservation of her offspring during the time of her pregnancy. She gives it then part of her nourishment in life, and after having suffered the sharpest pains at the moment of its birth, she then gives it suck, and continues her care and love to it. All this she does to the poor helpless infant, so void of reason that it knows not even her that is so good to it, nor can ask her for its own necessities. Full of tenderness for the welfare and happiness of her babe, her whole time, day and night, is spent in pleasing it, without the least prospect of any recompense for all her fatigue. After this, when the children are come to an age fit to be instructed, the fathers teach them all the good things they can for the conduct of their life. And if they know any man more capable to instruct them than themselves, they send them to him, without regard to the expense, thus indicating by their whole conduct what sincere pleasure it would afford them to see their children turn out men of virtue and probity. Undoubtedly, answered Lamprocles. If my mother had done all this, and 100 times as much, no man could suffer her ill humours. Do not you think, said Socrates, that the anger of a beast is much more difficult to support than that of a mother? Not of a mother like her, said Lamprocles. Socrates continued, What strange thing has she done to you? Has she bit you? Has she kicked you? As beasts do when they are angry? She has a tongue that no mortal can suffer, answered Lamprocles. And you? Replied Socrates. How many crosses did you give her in your infancy by your continual bawling and importunate actions? How much trouble by night and by day? How much affliction in your illnesses? At worst, answered Lamprocles, I never did nor said anything that might make her blush. Alas, said Socrates, is it more difficult for you to hear in patience the hasty expressions of your mother than it is for the comedians to hear what they say to one another on the stage when they fall into the most injurious reproaches? For they easily suffer it, knowing well that when one reviles another, he reviles him not with intent to injure him. And when one threatens another, he threatens not with design to do him any harm. You who are fully convinced likewise of the intentions of your mother, and who know very well that the hard words she gives you do not proceed from hate, but that she has a great affection for you, how can you, then, be angry with her? Is it because you imagine she wishes you ill? Not in the least, answered Lamprocles. I never had such a thought. What? Continued Socrates. A mother that loves you? A mother who, in your sickness, does all she can to recover your health? Who takes care that you want for nothing? Who makes so many vows to heaven for you? You say this is an ill mother? In truth, if you cannot live with her, I will say you cannot live at your ease. Tell me, in short, do you believe you ought to have any reverence or respect for any one whatever? Or do you not care for any man's favour and goodwill, neither for that of a general, suppose, or of any other magistrate? On the contrary, said Lamprocles, I am very careful to gain the goodwill of all men. Perhaps you would endeavour to acquire the goodwill of your neighbour, to the end he might do you kind offices, such as giving you fire when you want it, or, when any misfortune befalls you, speedily relieve you. Yes, I would. And if you were travelling with a man, either by sea or land, would you count it a matter of indifference whether you were loved by him or not? No, indeed. Are you then so abandoned, Lamprocles? Replied Socrates, that you would take pains to acquire the goodwill of those persons, and yet will do nothing to your mother, who loves you incomparably better than they? Know you not that the Republic concerns not herself with common instances of ingratitude, that she takes no cognizance of such crimes, and that she neglects to punish those who do not return the civilities they receive? But if any one be disrespectful to his parents, there is a punishment provided for such ingratitude. The laws reject him as an outlaw, and will not allow him to be received into any public office, because it is a maxim commonly received amongst us, that a sacrifice, one offered by an impious hand, cannot be acceptable to the gods, nor profitable to the Republic. Nobody can believe that a person of such a character can be capable to perform any great or worthy action, or to act the part of a righteous judge. The same punishment is ordained likewise for those who, after the death of their parents, neglect to honor their funerals, and this is particularly examined into the inquiry that is made into the lives of such as stand candidates for office. Therefore, my son, if you be wise, you will beseech heaven to pardon you the offences committed against your mother, to the end that the favours of the deity may still be continued to you, and that you may not forfeit them by an ungrateful behaviour. Take care, likewise, that the public may not discover the contempt you show her, for then who be blamed and abandoned by all the world? For if it were suspected that you did not gratefully resent the benefits conferred on you by your parents, no man could believe you would be grateful for any kind actions that others might do you. End of section 9. Section 10 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Elfman. Book 2, Chapter 3. Socrates reconciles Xenophon and Socrates, two brothers who were formerly at variance. Two brothers, whose names were Xenophon and Socrates, were at enmity with each other. Socrates was acquainted with them, and had a great mind to make them friends. Meeting, therefore, with Socrates, he accosted him thus: Are you too one of those who prefer the being rich to having a brother, and who do not consider that riches, being inanimate things, have need of being defended, whereas a brother is himself a good defence, and after all, that there is more money than brothers? For it is not extravagant in such men to imagine that a brother does them wrong because they enjoy not his estate. But say they not likewise that all world does them wrong because they are not in possession of what belongs to the rest of mankind? But they believe, with great reason, that it is better to live in society and be insured of all moderate estates, than to have the sole possession of all that is their neighbours, and to be exposed to the dangers that are inseparable from solitude. Nevertheless, they are not of the same opinion as to the company of their brothers. If they are rich, they buy themselves slaves to serve them, they procure themselves friends to stand by them, but for their brothers they neglect them, as if a brother were not so fit to make a friend of as another person. And yet it is of great efficacy towards the begetting and establishing of friendships, to have been born of the same parents and brought up together, since even beasts, we see, retain some inclination for those who have come from the same dams, and have been bred up and nourished together. Besides, a man who has a brother is the more regarded for, and men are more cautious to offend him. Socrates answered him thus: You are indeed in the right to say that a good brother is a great happiness, and unless there be a very strong case of dissension, I think that brothers ought a little to bear with one another, and not part on a slight occasion. But when a brother fails in all things, and is quite the reverse of what he ought to be, would you have a man do what is impossible, and continue in good amity with such a person? Socrates replied, Does your brother give offence to all the world as well as to you? Does nobody speak well of him? That, said Socrates, is one of the chief causes of the hatred I bear him, for he is sly enough to please others, but whenever we two happen to meet you, would think his sole design were to fall out with me. Socrates replied, Does not this proceed from what I am going to say? When any man would make use of a horse and knows not how to govern him, he can expect nothing from him but trouble. Thus, if we know not in what manner to behave ourselves towards our brother. Do we think we can expect anything from him but uneasiness? Why do you imagine, said Socrates, that I am ignorant in what manner I ought to carry myself to a brother, since I can show him as much love and respect both in my words and actions, as he can show me in his? But when I see a man endeavor to disoblige me in all manner of ways, shall I express any goodwill for that man? No, this is what I cannot do, and would not so much as endeavor it. I am astonished to hear you talk after this manner, said Socrates. Pray tell me, if you had a dog that were good to keep your flocks, who should fawn on your shepherds and grit his teeth and snarl whenever you come in his way, whether instead of being angry with him, you would not make much of him to bring him to know you? Now you say that a good brother is a great happiness. You confess that you know how to oblige him, and yet you put it not in practice to reconcile yourself with Xenophon. I fear I have not skill enough to compass it. I think, said Socrates, there will be no need of an extraordinary skill in the matter, and am certain that you have enough to engage him to wish you well, and to have a great value for you. Pray, cried Socrates, if you know any art, I have to make myself beloved. Let me know it immediately, for hitherto I never perceive any such thing. Answer me, said Socrates. If you desired that one of your friends should invite you to his feast when he offered a sacrifice, what course would you take? I would begin first to invite him to mine. And if you would engage him to take care of your affairs in your absence on a journey, what would you do? I would first, during his absence, take care of his. And if you would have a foreigner entertain you and his family when you come into his country, what method would you take? I would make him welcome at my house when he comes to this town, and would endeavor to further the dispatches of his business, that he might do me the like favor when I should be in the city where he lives. Strange, said Socrates, that you, who know the common methods of ingratiating yourself, will not be at the pains of practicing them. Why do you scruple to begin to practice those methods? Is it because you are afraid that, should you begin with your brother and first do him a kindness, you would appear to be of a mean-spirited and cringing disposition? Believe me, my friend, you will never, on that account, appear such. On the contrary, I take it to be the part of an heroic and generous soul to prevent our friends with kindness and our enemies with valor. Indeed, had I thought that Xenophon had been more proper than you to propose the reconciliation, I would have endeavored to have persuaded him to prevent you. But I take you be more fit to manage this matter, and believe you will bring it to pass rather than he. What you say is absurd and unworthy of you, replied Socrates. Would you have me break the ice, I, who am the younger brother? Do you forget that among all nations the honor to begin is reserved to the elder? What do you mean? Said Socrates. Must not a younger brother give the precedency to the older? Must he not rise up when he comes in, give him the best place, and hold his peace and let him speak? Delay, therefore, no longer to do what I desire you. Go and try to appease your brother. He will receive you with open arms. It is enough that he is a friend of honor and of a generous temper, for as there is no readier way to gain the goodwill of the mean and poor than by being liberal to them. So nothing has more influence on the mind of a man of honor and note than to treat him with respect and friendship. Socrates objected. When I have done what you say, if my brother should not be better tempered, what then? What harm would it be to you? Said Socrates. It will show your goodness, and that you love him, and make him appear to be ill-natured, and not deserving to be obliged by any man. I am of the opinion this will not happen. When he sees that you attack him with civilities and good offices, I am certain he will endeavor to get the better of you in so kind and generous a contention. You are now in the most wretched condition imaginable. It is as if the hands which God had given us reciprocally to aid each other were employed only to hinder one another, or as if the feet, which by the divine providence were made to assist each other to walk, were busied only in preventing one another from going forward. Would it not, then, be a great ignorance, at the same time a great misfortune, to turn to our disadvantage what was made only for our utility? And now it is certain that God has given us brothers only for our good, and that our two brothers are a great advantage to one another than it can be to either of them to have 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 eyes, and other the like members, which are double in our body, which nature has designed as brothers. The hands cannot at the same time reach 2 things several fathoms distance from one another. The feet cannot stretch themselves from the end of 1 fathom to another. The eyes which seem to discover from so far cannot, at the same time, see the fore and the hinder part of one and the same object. But when 2 brothers are good friends, no distance of place can hinder them from serving each other. End of section 10.
Section 11 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Stevens. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bysshe, Book 2, Chapter 4, A Discourse of Socrates Concerning Friendship. I remember likewise a discourse which I have heard him make concerning friendship, and that may be of great use to instruct us by what means we ought to procure ourselves friends, and in what manner we should live with them. He said that most men agree that a true friend is a precious treasure, and that nevertheless there is nothing about which we can give ourselves so little trouble as to make men our friends. We take care, said he, to buy houses, lands, slaves, flocks, and household goods, and when we have them, we endeavor to keep them. But though a friend is allowed to be capable of affording us a far greater happiness than any of all of these, yet how few are solicitous to procure themselves a friend, or, when they have, to secure his friendship. Nay, some men are so stupid as to prefer their very slaves to their friends. How else can we account for their want of concern about the latter, when either in distress or sickness, and at the same time their extreme anxiety for the recovery of the former when in the same condition? For then immediately physicians are sent for, and all remedies that can be thought of applied to their relief. Should both of them happen to die, they will regret more the loss of their slave than that of their friend, and shed more tears over the grave of the former than of the latter. They take care of everything but their friends. They will examine into and take great notice of the smallest trifle in their affairs, which perhaps stand in no need of their care, but neglect their friends that do. In short, though they have many estates, they know them all. But though they have but few friends, yet they know not the number of them, insomuch that if they are desired to name them, they are puzzled immediately, so little are their friends in their thoughts. Nevertheless, there is nothing comparable to a good friend. No slave is so affectionate to our person or interest. No horse can render us so great service. In a word, nothing is so useful to us in all occasions. For a true friend supplies all the wants and answers all the demands of another, either in the conduct of his private affairs or in the management of the public. If, for instance, his friend be obliged to do a kindness to any man, he puts him in the way of it. If he be assaulted with any danger, he immediately flies to his relief. At one time he gives him part of his estate, at another he assists him with the labor of his hands. Sometimes he helps him to persuade, sometimes he aids him to compel. In prosperity he heightens his delight by rejoicing with him. In adversity he diminisheth his sorrows by bearing a share of them. The use a man may make of his hands, his eyes, his ears, his feet, is nothing when at all compared to the service one friend may render another. For often what we cannot do for our own advantage, what we have not seen, nor thought, nor heard of, when our own interests were concerned, what we have not pursued for ourselves, a friend has done for his friend. How foolish were it to be at so much trouble in cultivating a small orchard of trees, because we expect some fruit from it, and yet be at no pains to cultivate that which is instead of a whole estate, I mean friendship, a soil, the most glorious and fertile, where we are sure to gather the fairest and best of fruit. End of section 11.
Section 12 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bysshe. Book 2, Chapter 5. Of the Worth and Value of Friends. To what I have advanced above, I shall here relate another discourse of his, as far as I can remember, in which he exhorted his hearers to examine themselves, that they might know what value their friends might set upon them. For seeing a man who has abandoned his friend in extreme poverty, he asked Antisthenes this question in presence of that very man and several others: Can we set a price upon friends as we do upon slaves? One slave may be worth 20 crowns, another not worth 5. Such a one will cost 50 crowns, another will yield 100. Nay, I am told that Nicias, the son of Niceratus, gave even 600 crowns for one slave to be inspector of his silver mines. Do you think we might likewise set prices upon friends? I believe we may, answered Antisthenes, for there are some men by whom I would rather choose to be loved than to have 20 crowns, others for whose affection I would not spend 5. I know some, too, for whose friendship I would give all I am worth. If it be so, said Socrates, it would be well that each man should consider how much he can be worth to his friends, and that he should endeavour to render himself as valuable as he can in their regard, to the end they might not abandon him. For when I hear one complain that his friend has betrayed him, another that he, whom he thought faithful, has preferred a small gain to the preservation of his friendship, I reflect on these stories, and ask whether, as we sell a good-for-nothing slave for what we can get for him, we are not likewise tempted to get rid of an ill friend when we are offered more for him than he is worth? Because I do not see men part with their slaves if they be good, nor abandon their friends if they be faithful. End of section 12. Section 13 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Jennifer Painter. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. Translated by Edward Bish. Book 2, Chapter 6. Of the Choice of Friends. The following conversation of Socrates with Critobulus may teach us how we ought to try friends, and with whom it is good to contract friendship. If we were to choose a friend, said Socrates to him, what precaution ought we to take? Ought we not to look out for a man who is not given to luxury, to drunkenness, to women, nor to idleness? For with these vices he could never be very useful to his friend, nor to himself. That is certain, answered Critobulus. Then, said Socrates, if we found a man that loved to live great, though he had not an estate to support the expense, and who, having daily occasion to employ the purses of his friends, should show by his actions that whatever you lend him is so much lost, and that if you do not lend him he will take it ill of you, do you not think that such a man would be very improper to make a friend of? There is no doubt of it, said Critobulus. And if we found another, continued Socrates, who was saving of what he had, but who, on the other hand, was so covetous that it would be quite unfit to have anything to do with him, because he would always be very ready to receive and never to give again? In my opinion, said Critobulus, this would be a worse friend than the former. And if we should find a man who was so carried away with the desire of enriching himself that he applied his mind to nothing else but getting all he could scrape together, we ought not to have anything to do with him neither, answered Critobulus, for he would be good to no man but himself. If we found a quarrelsome man, continued Socrates, who was every day like to engage all his friends in new broils and squabbles, what would you think of him? That he ought to be avoided, answered Critobulus. And if a man, said Socrates, were free from all these faults, and were only of a humour to desire to receive kindnesses, but never to concern himself to return them, what would you think of him? That neither he, too, would be proper to make a friend of, replied Critobulus. And indeed, after having rejected so many, I can scarce tell whom we should take. We ought to take, said Socrates, a man who were the reverse of all those we have mentioned, who would be temperate in his manners, faithful in his promises, and sincere in all his actions, who would think it a point of honour not to be outdone in civilities, so that it would be of advantage to have to do with him. But how can we be certain of all this, said Critobulus, before we have tried him? When we give our judgment of statuaries, we have no regard, replied Socrates, to what they say of themselves, but consider their works. and he who has already made good statues is the person of whom we have the best opinion for those he shall make in the future. Apply this to the question you asked me, and be assured that a man who has served his former friends well will be likely to show no less affection for those that come after, as we may strongly conjecture that a groom, whom we have formerly seen dress horses very well, is capable of dressing others. But, said Critobulus, when we have found a man worthy of our choice, how ought we to contract a friendship with him? In the first place, answered Socrates, we must inquire whether the gods approve of it. But supposing they do not dissuade us, how are we to take this precious prey? Not by hunting as we catch hares, said Socrates, nor in nets as we take birds, nor by force as we take our enemies. For it is very difficult to gain any man's friendship against his will, or stop him by force, and detain him in prison as a slave, seeing such ill usage would oblige him rather to wish us ill than to love us. What then ought we to do? Pursued Critobulus. It is reported, replied Socrates, that there are some words so powerful that they who know them make themselves loved by pronouncing them, and that there are likewise other charms for the same purpose. And where can one learn these words? Added Critobulus. Have you not read in Homer, answered Socrates, what the siren said to enchant Ulysses? The beginning of it is thus: O stay, O pride of Greece, Ulysses, stay. You say true, continued Critobulus, but did not they say as much to the others to stop them too? Not at all, said Socrates. They enchanted with these words only the generous men who were in love with virtue. I begin to understand you, said Critobulus, and seeing this charm, which is so powerful to enchant and captivate the mind, is nothing but praise, you mean that we ought to praise a man in such a manner that he may not distrust we laugh at him. Otherwise, instead of gaining his affection, we shall incur his hate, for it would be insupportable to a man, who knows he is little and weak, to be praised for his graceful appearance, for being well-shaped and of a robust constitution. But do you know no other charms? No, answered Socrates, but I have indeed heard it said that Pericles knew a great many, by means of which he charmed the republic and gained the favour and esteem of all. Critobulus continued, what was it that Themistocles did to make himself so esteemed? He used no other charms, said Socrates, than the eminent services he rendered to the state. Which is as much as to say, replied Critobulus, that to gain the friendship of the great, we must render ourselves capable to perform great actions. And could you think it possible, said Socrates, that any one should share in the friendship of men of merit without being possessed of one good quality? Why not? Answered Critobulus. I have seen despicable rhetoricians beloved by the most famous orators, and persons who knew nothing of war live in familiarity with great generals. But have you seen men who are fit for nothing, for that is the question we speak of, get any friends of consequence? I confess I have not, answered Critobulus. Nevertheless, since it is impossible for a man of no worth whatever to have the friendship of men of condition and merit, tell me whether the man who acquires the character of worth and merit obtains, at the same time, the friendship of all who possess that excellent character? The reason, I suppose, why you ask this question, answered Socrates, is because you frequently observe dissensions among those who equally cherish honour, and would all of them rather die than commit a base action. And you are surprised that instead of living in friendship, they disagree among themselves, and are sometimes more difficult to reconcile than the vilest of all man. This is a misfortune, added Critobulus, that arrives not among private men only, for dissensions, nay, even wars, will happen sometimes, to break out in the best governed republics, where virtue is in the highest repute, and where vice is held in the utmost contempt. Now, when I revolve these considerations in my mind, I know not where to go in search of friends. For it is impossible, we see, for the wicked to cultivate a true friendship among themselves. Can there subsist a true and lasting friendship amongst the ungrateful, the idle, the covetous, the treacherous, and the dissolute? No, for persons of such a character will mutually expose themselves to hatred and contempt, to hatred because of the hurtful effects of their vices, to contempt on account of the deformity of them. Neither, on the other hand, can we expect, as you have well observed, to find friendship between a virtuous man and a person of the opposite character. For how can they who commit crimes be in good amity with those that abhor them? But what puzzles me most, my dear Socrates, is to see men of merit and virtue harassing one another, and endeavouring, to the utmost of their power, to crush and ruin their antagonists, when, in different interests, both are contending for the most lucrative posts of the republic. I am quite at a loss to account for such a conduct on the principles of friendship. For when I daily observe the noblest affections of the mind rooted up by the sordid views of interest, I am in a great doubt whether there is any real friendship and affection in the world. My dear friend, replied Socrates, this matter is very intricate, for, if I mistake not, nature has placed in men the principles both of friendship and dissension. Of friendship, because they have need of one another, they have compassion of their miseries, they relieve one another in their necessities, and they are grateful for the assistances which they lend one another. Of dissension, because one and the same thing being agreeable to many they contend to have it, and endeavour to prejudice and thwart one another in their designs. Thus strife and anger beget war, avarice stifles benevolence, envy produces hate. But friendship, overcoming all these difficulties, finds out the virtuous and unites them together. For, out of a motive of virtue, they choose rather to live quietly in a mean condition than to gain the empire of the whole earth by the calamities of war. When they are pinched with hunger or thirst, they endure them with constancy, till they can relieve themselves without being troublesome to any one. When at any time their desires for the enjoyments of love grow violent and headstrong, then reason, or self-government, lays hold on the reins, checks the impetuosity of the passion, keeps it within due bounds, and will not allow them to transgress the great rule of their duty. They enjoy what is lawfully their own, and are so far from usurping the rights and properties of others, that they even give them part of what they have. They agree their differences in such a manner that all are gainers, and no man has reason to complain. They are never transported with anger so far as to commit any action of which they may afterwards repent. Envy is a passion they are ignorant of, because they live in a mutual communication of what they possess, and consider what belongs to their friends as things in their own possession. From hence you see that the virtuous do not only not oppose, but that they aid one another in the employments of the republic. For they who seek for honours and great offices, only to have an opportunity of enriching themselves and exercising a cruel tyranny, or to live an easy and effeminate life, are certainly very wicked and unjust, nor can they ever hope to live in friendship with any man. But why should he who desires not any authority, but only the better to defend himself from the wicked, or to assist his friends, or be serviceable to his country, why should such a man, I say, not agree with another, whose intentions are the same with his own? Is it because he would be less capable to serve the republic if he had virtuous associates in the administration of affairs? If, in the tournaments and other games, the most strong were permitted to enter into a league against the weaker, they would infallibly be victors in all the courses, and win all the prizes. for which reason they are not suffered to do so. Therefore, in affairs of state, since no man is hindered from joining with whom he pleases to do good to the Republic, is it not more advantageous, when we concern ourselves in the government, to make friendship with men of honour and probity, who are generally, too, the most knowing and capable, and to have them for our associates, than to make them our adversaries? For it is manifest that when a man is engaged in a combat, he ought to have some to assist him, and that he will have need of a great many, if those whom he opposes be valiant and powerful. Besides, he must be liberal, and give presents to those who espouse his quarrel, to encourage them to make a more resolute and vigorous defence. Now it is beyond all dispute that it is much better to oblige the good, though they are but few, than the wicked, of whom there is a great number, because the former are easily gained over to your side, whereas the latter are hardly won by the best favours, and those in the greatest abundance too, to espouse your interest. However it be, Critobulus, take courage, endeavour only to become virtuous, and then boldly pursue the friendship of honest men. This is a sort of chase in which I may be helpful to you, because I am naturally inclined to love. I attack briskly those I love, and lay out all my skill to make myself beloved by them. I endeavour to kindle in their minds a flame like mine, and to make them desire my company as ardently as I long for theirs. You stand in need of this address when you would contract a friendship with any one. Hide not, then, the secrets of your soul from me, but let me know who they are for whom you have a regard. For, having made it my study to please those who were agreeable to me, I believe that, by long experience, I now have got some considerable insight into the pursuits and ways of men. I have longed a great while, said Critobulus, to learn this art, especially if it may be employed to gain me the friendship of those whose persons are not only comely and genteel, but whose minds are replenished and adorned with all virtue. Socrates replied, But my method forbids to use violence, and I am of opinion that all men fled from the wretch Scylla because she detained them by force, whereas the Sirens did no violence to any man, and employed only their tuneful voices to detain those who passed near them, so that all stopped to hear, and suffered themselves to be insensibly charmed by the music of their songs. Be sure, said Critobulus, that I will use no violence to them whose friendship I would gain, and therefore delay no longer to teach me your art. Will you give me your word likewise, said Socrates, that you will not even give them a kiss? I promise you, said Critobulus, I will not, unless they are very beautiful persons. You mistake the matter, replied Socrates. The beautiful permit not those liberties, but the ugly grant them freely enough, because they know very well that should any beauty be ascribed to them, it is only in consideration of that of the soul. I will not transgress in this point, said Critobulus. Only impart to me the secret you know to gain friends. When you would contract a friendship with any one, said Socrates, you must give me leave to tell him that you have a great esteem for him, and that you desire to be his friend. With all my heart, answered Critobulus, for sure no man can wish ill to a man who esteems him. And if I add besides, continued Socrates, that because you set a great value on his merit, you have much affection for his person, will you not take it amiss? Not at all, said Critobulus, for I am sensible we have a great kindness for those who bear us good will. I may then, said Socrates, speak in that manner to those whom you desire to love, but will you likewise give me leave to advance that your greatest pleasure is to have good friends, that you take great care of them, that you behold their good actions with as much joy as if you yourself had performed them, and that you rejoice at their good fortune as much as at your own, that you are never weary when you are serving them, and that you believe it is the glory of a man of honour to surpass his friends in benefits, and his enemies in valour. By this means I think I shall be very useful to you in procuring you good friends. Why do you ask me leave? Said Critobulus, as if you might not say of me whatever you please. No, indeed, answered Socrates, for I remember what Aspasia once said, that matchmakers are successful in their business when they tell truth of the persons in whose behalf they court, but that the marriages made by their lies are unfortunate, because they who are deceived hate one another, and hate yet more the person that put them together. And therefore, for the same reason, I think I ought not to tell lies in your praise. You are then, so far, only my friend, replied Critobulus, that if I have any good qualities to make myself be esteemed, you will assist me. If not, you will invent nothing in my behalf. And do you think, said Socrates, that I should do you more service in giving you false praises that are not your due, than by exhorting you to merit the praise of all men? If you doubt of this, consider the consequences of it. If, for instance, I should tell the owner of a ship that you are an excellent pilot, and that he upon that should give you the conduct of the vessel, what hopes could you have that you should not perish? Or if I should say, publicly, that you are an experienced general or a great politician, and if you, by that character which I should unjustly have obtained for you, should be promoted to the supreme magistracy, to what dangers would you expose your own life and the fortune of the state? Or if I should make any private person believe that you were a good economist, and he should trust you afterwards with the care of his family, would you not be the ruin of his estate, and expose yourself to ridicule and contempt? Which is as much to say, Critobulus, that the shortest and surest way to live with honour in the world is to be in reality what we would appear to be. And if you observe, you will find that all human virtues increase and strengthen themselves by the practice and experience of them. Take my advice, then, and labour to acquire them. But if you are of a different opinion, pray let me know it. I might well be ashamed, answered Critobulus, to contradict you, for no good nor solid objection can be brought against so rational an assertion. End of section 13. Section 14 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bish. Book 2, Chapter 7. Socrates showeth Aristarchus how to get rid of poverty. Socrates had an extreme tenderness for his friends, and if through imprudence they fell into any misfortune, he endeavoured to comfort them by his good counsels. If they laboured under poverty, he did all he could to relieve them, teaching all men that they ought mutually to assist one another in necessity. I will set down some examples of his behaviour in these occasions. Meeting Aristarchus, who looked very dejected, he said to him, I see, Aristarchus, that something troubles you, but impart the cause of your grief to your friends, and perhaps we may comfort you. Indeed, said he, I am in great affliction, for since the late troubles, many persons having fled for shelter to the Piraeus, it has so fallen out that my sisters, nieces, and cousins have all thrown themselves upon me, so that I have no less than 14 of them to maintain. You know very well that we receive no profit of our lands, the enemies being masters of the open country. Our houses in the city are uninhabited, there being at present very little company in Athens. Nobody will buy any goods, no man will lend money upon any interest whatever, and I believe we may as soon take it up in the middle of the streets as to find where to borrow it. And I am much concerned that I shall not be able to assist my relations, whom I see ready to perish, while it is impossible for me to maintain them in the present scarcity of all things. Socrates, having heard him patiently, said to him, "How comes it to pass that Cerimon, who has so many persons in his family, finds means not only to maintain them, but likewise to enrich himself by the profit he makes of them, and that you are afraid of starving to death because you have a great many in your family?" "The reason," answered Aristarchus, "is this: Cerimon has none but slaves to take care of, and I am to provide for persons who are free." Socrates went on, "For which have you most esteem, for Cerimon's slaves, or for the persons who are at your house?" "There is no comparison between them," said Aristarchus. "Is it not then a shameful thing," replied Socrates, "that Cerimon should grow rich by means of those whom you acknowledge to be of less value, and that you should grow poor and be reduced to straits, though you keep men of condition in your house, whom you value more?" "By no means," said Aristarchus. "There is a wide difference betwixt the two. The slaves that Cerimon keeps follow some trades, but the persons I have with me have had a liberal education, and follow none." "May not he," replied Socrates, "who knows how to do anything that is useful be said to know a trade?" "Yes, certainly." "And are not," continued Socrates, "oatmeal, bread, the clothes of men and women, cassocks, coats, and other the like manufactures, things very useful?" "Without doubt." "And do not the persons at your house know how to make any of these things?" "On the contrary," said Aristarchus, "I believe they know how to make all of them." "What are you then afraid of?" added Socrates. "Why do you complain of poverty, since you know how to get rich? Do not you observe how wealthy Nausicydes is become, what numerous herds he is master of, and what vast sums he lends the Republic? Now what makes this man so rich? Why, nothing but one of those manufactures we mentioned, that of making oatmeal. You see too that Certes keeps all his family, and lives at his ease upon what he has got by being a baker. And how doth Demias of the village of Colotus get his livelihood? By making cassocks. What makes Menon live so comfortably? His cloak manufacture. And are not most of the inhabitants of Megara in good circumstances enough by the trade which they drive of coats and short jackets?" "I grant all this," said Aristarchus, "but still there is a difference betwixt these persons and me, for whereas they have had with them some barbarians whom they have bought and compelled to work what brings them in gain, I, for my part, keep only ladies and gentlemen at my house, persons who are free, and some of them my own relations. Now would you have me to set them to work?" "And because they are free and your relations," said Socrates, "do you think they ought to do nothing but eat and sleep? Do you observe that they, who live thus idle and at their ease, lead more comfortable lives than others? Do you think them more content, more cheerful, that is to say, more happy than those who employ themselves in any of those manufactures we have mentioned, or in whatever else tends to the utility or convenience of life? Do you imagine that idleness and laziness contribute towards our learning things necessary, that they can enable us to retain those things we have already learnt, that they help to strengthen the body or keep it in health, that they can assist us to get riches or keep what we have got already? And do you believe that labour and industry are good for nothing? Why did your ladies learn what you say they know? Did they believe them to be useless things, and had they resolved never to put them in practice? Or, on the contrary, was it with design to employ themselves in those matters, and to get something by them? Is it a greater piece of wisdom to sit still and do nothing, than to busy oneself in things that are of use in life, and that turn to account? And is it not more reasonable for a man to work than to be with his arms across, thinking how he shall do to live? Shall I tell you my mind, Aristarchus? Well, then, I am of opinion that in the condition you are in, you cannot love your guests, nor they you, for this reason, that you, on the one hand, feel they are a burden to you, and they, on the other, perceive you uneasy and discontented on their account. And it is to be feared that the discontent will increase on both sides, and that the sense of past favours will wear off. But when you set them to work, you will begin to love them, because they will bring you some profit, and when they find that you regard them with more complacency, they will not fail to have more love for you. The remembrance of your kindnesses will be more grateful to them, and the obligations they have to you will be the greater. In a word, you will be kinder relations and better friends. Indeed, if what they were to do was a thing worthy of blame, it would be better to die than to think of it. But what they can do is honourable and becoming of their sex, and whoever knows how to do a thing well will acquit himself of it with honour and pleasure. Therefore, defer no longer to make the proposal to them, since it will be so advantageous to all of you, and be assured they will receive it with joy and pleasure. Good God, what a fine scheme you have proposed! Indeed, I cannot but approve of it. Nay, it has made such a wonderful impression on my mind, that whereas I was lately against borrowing money at all, because I saw that when I had spent it I should not be in a condition to repay it, I am now resolved to go try where I can take some up on any terms, to buy tools and other materials to set ourselves to work. What was proposed was forthwith executed. Aristarchus bought what he wanted, he laid in a provision of wool, and the ladies worked from morning to night. This occupation diverted their melancholy, and, instead of the uneasiness there was before between them and Aristarchus, they began to live in a reciprocal satisfaction. The ladies loved him as their protector, and he considered them as persons who were very useful and necessary to him. To conclude, some time afterwards Aristarchus came to see Socrates, and related the whole matter to him with great content, and told him the women began to complain that none but he was idle. "Why do you not put them in mind," said Socrates, "of the fable of the dog? For, in the days when beasts could speak, according to the fable, the sheep said to her master, 'You are a strange man. We yield you wool, lambs, and cheeses, and yet you give us nothing but what we can get upon the ground. And the dog, who brings you in no profit, is kindly used, for you feed him with the same bread you eat yourself.' The dog, overhearing this complaint, answered her, 'It is not without reason that I am used so well. It is I who protect you. It is I who hinder thieves from taking you away, and wolves from sucking your blood. If I were not always keeping watch about you, you would not dare so much as to go to feed.' This answer was the reason that the sheep yielded freely to the dog the honour they pretended to before. In like manner, do you also let these ladies know that it is you who are their guardian and protector, and that you watch over them for their safety with as much care as a faithful and courageous dog watcheth over a herd committed to his charge. Tell them that because of you no man dares hurt them, and that it is by your means that they live at ease and in safety." End of section 14.
Section 15 of The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bishey. Book 2, Chapter 8. Socrates persuades Euthyphros to abandon his former way of living, and to betake himself to some more useful and honourable employment. Another time, meeting with Euthyphros, one of his old friends, whom he had not seen for a great while before, he inquired of him from whence he came. "At present," answered Euthyphros, "I come not from abroad, but towards the end of the war I returned from a voyage I had made, for after having lost all the estate I had upon the frontiers, and my father having left me nothing in Attica, I was forced to work for my living, and I believe it better to do so than to be troublesome to others. Besides, I can no longer borrow anything, because I have nothing left to mortgage." "And how much longer," said Socrates, "do you think you shall be able to work for your living?" "Alas, but a short while," answered Eutherus. "Nevertheless," replied Socrates, "when you come to be old, it will cost you something to maintain yourself, and yet you will not then be able to earn anything." "You say very true." "You had best then," continued Socrates, "employ yourself now in business that will enable you to lay by something for your old age, and get into the service of some rich man who has occasion for an economist, to have the inspection over his workmen, to gather in his fruits, to preserve what belongs to him, that he may reward you for the service you do to him." "I should find it very difficult," replied Eutherus, "to submit to be a slave." "Yet," said Socrates, "the magistrates in republics, and all that are in employments, are not, therefore, reputed slaves. On the contrary, they are esteemed honourable." "Be that as it will," said Eutherus, "I can never think of entering into any office where I might be liable to blame, for I would not like to be censured by another." "But where," said Socrates, "will you find any employment in which a man is absolutely perfect and altogether free from blame? For it is very difficult to be so exact as not to fail sometimes, and even though we should not have failed, it is hard to escape the censure of bad judges. And I should think it a very odd and surprising thing if in that very employment wherein you say you are now engaged, you were so dexterous and expert, so that no man should find anything amiss. What you are, therefore, to observe is to avoid those who make it their business to find fault without reason, and to have to do with more equitable persons; to undertake what you can actually perform; to reject what you find yourself unfit to do; and when you have taken in hand to do anything, to accomplish it in a manner the most excellent and perfect you can. Thus you will be less subject to be blamed, will find relief to your poverty, lead an easier life, be out of danger, and will sufficiently provide for the necessities of your old age." End of section 15. Section 16 of The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bishey. Book 2, Chapter 9. In what manner Socrates taught his friend Crito to rid himself of some informers who took the advantage of his easy temper. One day Crito, happening to meet Socrates, complained to him that it was very difficult for a man who would keep what he had to live in Athens. "For," said he, "I am now sued by some men, though I never did them the least injury, but only because they know that I had rather give them a little money than embroil myself in the troubles of law." Socrates said to him, "Do you keep dogs to hinder the wolves from coming at your flocks?" "You need not doubt but I do," answered Crito. "Ought you not likewise," replied Socrates, "to keep a man who were able to drive away all those that trouble you without cause?" "I would with all my heart," said Crito, "but that I fear that in the end he, too, would turn against me." "Why so?" said Socrates. "Is it not better to serve a man like you, and to receive favours from him, than to have him for an enemy? You may be certain that there are in this city many men who would think themselves very happy to be honoured with your friendship." After this they happened to see a certain person named Archedimus, who was a man of very good parts, eloquent, and extremely skilful in the management of affairs, but withal very poor and in a low condition, for he was not of that sordid disposition to take all he could get, by what means soever, but he was a lover of justice and of honest men, and abhorred to make rich, or to raise himself by informing and backbiting; for he held that nothing was more base than that wretched practice of those miscreants called sycophants, or informers. Crito cast an eye upon him, and as often as they brought him any corn, or wine, or oil, or any other thing from his country houses, he sent him some of it. When he offered sacrifices, he invited him to the feasts, and showed him many civilities of the like nature. Archidemus, seeing the doors of that house open to him at all times, and that he always found so favourable a reception, laid aside all his former dependencies, and trusted himself wholly to Crito. Then he made it his business immediately to inquire into the characters of those sycophants who had slandered Crito or informed against him, and found them to be guilty of many crimes, and that they had a great number of enemies. This encouraged him to take them to task, and he prosecuted one of them for a crime which would have subjected him to a corporal punishment, or at least to a pecuniary mulct. This fellow, who knew his case to be bad, and that he could not justify himself, employed all sorts of stratagems to get rid of Archidemus, who nevertheless would not quit his hold till the other had discharged Crito and given him money besides, in name of trouble and charges. He managed several of his affairs with like success, which made Crito be thought happy in having him. And as when a shepherd has an excellent dog, the other shepherds are glad to bring their flocks near his, that they may be safe likewise, so several of Crito's friends began to make their court to him, and begged him to lend them Archidemus to defend them. He, for his part, was glad to oblige Crito, and it was observed at length that not only Crito lived undisturbed, but all his friends likewise. And if any one reproached Archidemus that self-interest had made him the master's creature, and to adore him and be so faithful and zealous in his service, he would answer him thus: "Which of the two do you think most dishonourable, to do services to men of quality from whom we have received favours, and to enter into their friendship to declare war against bad men, or to endeavour to prejudice men of honour, and to make them our enemies, that bad men may be our friends?" From thenceforward Crito contracted a strict friendship with Archidemus, and all his friends had likewise a great respect for him. Section 17. Of The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bishey. Book 2, Chapter 10. Socrates advises Diodorus to do justice to the merit of Hermogenes, and to accept of his service and friendship. Socrates, meeting one day with Diodorus, addressed him thus: "If one of your slaves ran away, would you give yourself any trouble to find him?" "Yes, certainly," answered he, "and I would give public notice, and promise a reward to any that brought him to me." "And if one of them were sick, would you take care of him, and send for physicians to endeavour to save his life?" "Without doubt I would." "And if you saw," replied Socrates, "one of your friends, that is to say, a person who renders you 1,000 times more service than a slave, reduced to extreme want, ought you not to relieve him? I speak this to you on account of Hermogenes. You very well know he is not ungrateful, and that he would scorn to receive the least favour from you and not return you the like. You know likewise that a great number of slaves are not to be valued like one man, who serves willingly, who serves with zeal and affection, and who is not only capable of doing what he is desired, but who can likewise of himself think of many things that may be of service to us, who reasons well, who foresees what may happen, and from whom we may expect to receive good advice. Now, the best managers hold it as a maxim that when we find anything of value to be sold cheap, we ought to buy it. Think of it, therefore, for as times now go, you may procure yourself many friends at a cheap rate." "You say right," replied Diodorus, "and therefore pray send Hermogenes to me." Excuse me in that, answered Socrates. You would do as well to go to him yourself as to send for him. This discourse was the reason that Diodorus went to Hermogenes, and for a small gratification obliged him to be his friend, after which Hermogenes took particular care to please Diodorus, and sought all opportunities of serving him and of giving him content. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Beachy. Book 3, Chapter 1. Of the Qualifications of a General. Let us now see how Socrates was serviceable to those who were desirous to qualify themselves for employments of trust and honor, by advising them to apply themselves diligently to the study of their duty, that they might acquire a perfect knowledge of it. Having heard that there was arrived at Athens one Dionysodorus, who undertook to teach the art of war, he made the following discourse to one of his friends, who pretended to one of the highest posts in the army. It were a scandalous thing, said Socrates to him, for a man who aims to be chief over others, to neglect to learn how to command, when so fair an opportunity offers. Nay, I think he would rather deserve to be punished than the man who should undertake to make a statue without having learned the sculptor's trade. For as in war the whole fortune of the republic is trusted to the general, it is to be presumed that his good conduct will procure success, and that his faults will be followed with great losses. And therefore a man who should neglect to make himself capable of such an employment, and yet pretend to it, ought to be severely punished. By these reasons he persuaded this young man to get himself instructed. After the youth had imagined that he had acquired some knowledge of the art, he returned to pay Socrates a visit, who, jesting him, addressed the company that were present in this manner: Do not you think, gentlemen, that as Homer, when speaking of Agamemnon, gives him the surname of Venerable, we ought also to bestow the same epithet on this young man, who justly deserves to be called by that name, since, like him, he has learned how to command? For as a man who can play on the lute is a player on that instrument, though he never touches it, and as he who is knowing in the art of physic is a physician, though he never practise, so this young man, having learned to command, is become a general, though not a man of us should ever give our voice to make him so. On the contrary, it is in vain for him who knows not how to command to get himself chosen. He will not be one jot a better general for it, no more than he who knows nothing of physic is a better physician, because he has the reputation of being one. Then, turning towards the young man, he went on: But because it might happen that one of us may have the honor of commanding a regiment or a company in the troops that are to compose your army, to the end we may not be entirely ignorant of the military art, pray tell us by what he began to instruct you. By what he ended, answered the young man, for he showed me only the order that ought to be observed in an army, either in marching, encamping, or fighting. But what is that, said Socrates, in comparison of the many other duties incumbent on a general? He must besides take care for the preparations of war, he must furnish the soldiers with necessary ammunition and provisions, he must be inventive, laborious, diligent, patient, quick of apprehension, he must be mild and rigorous together, he must be open and close, he must know to preserve his own, and take what is another's, he must be prodigal and a ravager, he must be liberal and covetous, he must be wary and yet enterprising. I confess that he ought to know likewise how to draw up his troops in order of battle, and indeed order and discipline are the most important things in an army, and without them it is impossible to have any other service of the troops than of a confused heap of stones, bricks, timber, and tiles. But when everything is in its due place, as in a building, when the foundations and the covering are made of materials that will not grow rotten, and which no wet can damage, such as are stones and tiles, and when the bricks and timber are employed in their due places in the body of the edifice, they altogether make a house, which we value among our most considerable enjoyments. Here the young man, interrupting him, said, "This comparison puts me in mind of another thing that generals ought to observe, which is, to place their best soldiers in the first and last ranks, and the others in the middle, that those in the first rank may draw them on, and those in the last push them forward." "He has taught you too," said Socrates, "how to know the good and the bad soldiers asunder, otherwise this rule can be of no use to you. For if you were to reckon money upon a table, and were ordered to lay the best at the two ends and the worst in the middle, how could you do this if you had not been shown how to distinguish between the good and the bad?" "Indeed," replied the young man, "he did not teach me what you mention, and I suppose we must learn of ourselves to discern the good soldiers from the bad." "If you please," continued Socrates, "let us consider how a general ought to govern himself in this matter. If it were to take any money, ought he not to make the most covetous march in the front? If it were an action of great peril, ought he not to send the most ambitious, because they are the men who, out of a desire of glory, rush into the midst of dangers? And as for them, you would not be much troubled to know them, for they are forward enough in discovering themselves. But tell me, when this master showed you the different ways of ordering an army, did he teach you when to make use of one way and when of another?" "Not at all," answered he. "And yet," replied Socrates, "the same order is not always to be observed, nor the same commands given, but to be changed according to the different occasions." "He taught me nothing of that," said the young man. "Go to him, then," added Socrates, "and ask him concerning it, for if he know anything of the matter and have ever so little honor, he will be ashamed to have taken your money and send you away so ill instructed." Section 19 of The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon, translated by Edward Bishey. Book 3, Chapter 2. The Character of a Good Prince. Another time he asked the general, whom the Athenians had lately chosen, why Homer calls Agamemnon the pastor of the people. "Is it not," said he, "because as a shepherd ought to take care of his flocks, that they be well and want for nothing, so a general ought to take care to keep his soldiers always in a good condition, to see they be supplied with provisions, and to bring to a happy issue the design that made them take arms, which is to overcome their enemies and to live more happily afterwards. And why does the same poet praise Agamemnon likewise for being at once a gracious prince and generous warrior? For is it not true that to gain a prince the character of being generous and a warrior too, it is not sufficient to be brave in his own person and to fight with intrepidity, but he must likewise animate the whole army and be the cause that every soldier behave himself like him? And to gain the reputation of a good and gracious prince, it is not enough to have secured his private affairs, he must also take care that plenty and happiness be seen in all places of his dominions. For kings are not chosen to take care of themselves only, but to render happy the people who choose them. All people engage in war only to secure their own quiet, and choose commanders that they may have guides to conduct them to the end which they propose to themselves. A general therefore ought to prepare the way of good fortune to those who raise him to that dignity. This is the most glorious success he can desire, as nothing can be more ignominious to him that do the contrary. We see by this discourse that Socrates, designing to give the idea of good prince, required scarce anything of him but to render his subjects happy. End of section 19.
Section 20 of the Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Vina. The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates by Xenophon. Translated by Edward Bish. Book 3, Chapter 3. On the Business of a General of Horse. Socrates at another time, as I well remember, had the following conference with a general of the cavalry. What was your reason, said Socrates, to desire this office? I cannot think it was that you might march first at the head of the troops, for the horse archers are to march before you. Nor can I believe it was to make yourself be known, for no men are more generally known than madmen. Perhaps it was because you thought you could mend what was amiss in the cavalry, and make the troops better than they are, to the end that if the Republic should have occasion to use them, you might be able to do your country some eminent service. That is my design, answered the other. It were well you could do this, said Socrates. But does not your office oblige you to have an eye on the horses and troopers? Most certainly. What course will you then take, continued Socrates, to get good horses? It is not my business to look to that, replied the general. Every trooper must take care for himself. And what, said Socrates, if they bring you horses whose feet and legs are good for nothing, or that are so weak and lean that they cannot keep up with the others, or so restive and vicious that it would be impossible to make them keep their ranks? What good could you expect from such cavalry? What service would you be able to do the state? You are much in the right, Socrates, and I promise you I will take care what horses are in my troops. And will you not have an eye likewise on the troopers? Yes, answered he. In my opinion, then, answered Socrates, the first thing you ought to do is to make them learn to get a horseback. No doubt of it, replied the general, for by that means they would the more easily escape if they should happen to be thrown off their horses. Socrates went on. You ought also to make them exercise, sometimes here, sometimes there, and particularly in places like those where the enemy generally is, that they may be good horsemen in all sorts of countries. For when you are to fight, you will not send to bid the enemy come to you in the plain, where you used to exercise your horse. You must train them up likewise to lance the spear, and if you would make them very brave fellows, you must inspire them with a principle of honor, and inflame them with rage against the enemy. Fear not, said he, that I will spare my labor. But have you, resumed Socrates, thought on the means to make yourself obeyed? For without that, all your brave troopers will avail you nothing. It is true, said he, but how shall I gain that point of them? Know you not, said Socrates, that in all things men readily obey those whom they believe most capable? Thus, in our sickness, we most willingly submit to the prescriptions of the best physicians, at sea to the most skilful pilot, and in affairs of agriculture to him who has most experience in it. All this I grant you. It is then to be presumed that in the conduct of the cavalry, he who makes it appear that he understands it best will be the person whom the others will be best pleased to obey. But if I let them see that I am most worthy to command, will that be sufficient to make them obey me? Yes, certainly, said Socrates, if you can persuade them besides that their honor and safety depend on that obedience. And how shall I be able to make them sensible of this? With less trouble, answered Socrates, than it would be to prove that it is better to be virtuous than vicious. Then a general, added the other, ought to study the art of speaking well? Do you imagine, said Socrates, that he will be able to execute his office without speaking a word? It is by speech that we know what the laws command us to learn for the conduct of our lives. No excellent knowledge can be attained without the use of speech. The best method to instruct is by discourse, and they who are thoroughly versed in the sciences speak with the applause of all the world. But have you observed, continued he, that in all sorts of occasions the Athenians distinguish themselves above all the Greeks, and that no republic can show such youths as that of Athens? For example, when we sent from hence a choir of musicians to the temple of Apollo in the isle of Delos, it is certain that none comparable to them are sent from other cities. Not that the Athenians have better voices than the others, nor that their bodies are more robust and better made, but the reason is because they are more fond of honor, and this desire of honor is what excites men to excellent actions. Do not you think, therefore, that if good care were taken of our cavalry, it would excel that of other nations in the beauty of arms and horses, in order of good discipline, and in bravery in fight, provided the Athenians were persuaded that this would be a means to acquire them glory and renown? I am of your opinion. Go then, and take care of your troops, said Socrates. Make them serviceable to you, that you may be so to the republic. Your advice is good, said he, and I will immediately follow it. End of section 20.